Welcome to CinemaScope, the podcast that bridges film genres, subgenres, and movements, ultimately deepening our understanding of them all. I'm Andy Nelson, your host, and today we are discussing heist films. Joining me today, I have two very exciting guests. First up, Luka Arsenjuk, an associate professor from the University of Maryland. Luka, hello.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. And Tim Palmer, the new chair of the Department of Film and Media Arts at the University of Utah. Tim, welcome.
Hello, Andy. Thanks for having me. Hello, Luka.
I'm so happy to have you both here. And I want to start this conversation with both of you by getting a sense from each of you as to really kind of what drew you to this fantastic subgenre. Luka, let's start with you.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I've always been drawn to sort of Hollywood genres, classical Hollywood genre, the question of genre in general, even though I've worked in other things. I published a book on the Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein, which, I couldn't be further from something like the Heist film, maybe. But the heist film as a genre interests me, or has begun interesting me, partly because, of the exciting kind of plot that it typically features, the fact that it depicts a group of people engaged in a collective project of some kind of adventurous, subversive kind. And that in some sense it's particularly rare in Hollywood genres to have a group or a collective as a protagonist, which sort of makes the genre stand out. And also the fact that it appears in the history of Hollywood right at the moment which I'm sure we'll get to later in the discussion as well, right at the moment where the kind of classical, studio system set of genres begin to experience a kind of crisis toward late 40s, early 50s. And so it's a kind of strange transitional genre right in between sort of the kind of classical period and then the emerging sort of new Hollywood, which really sort of takes shape in the 1970s. And so it's an occasion for, I think, a lot of independent filmmakers also to kind of try out their own visions of cinema while staying grounded in some kind of genre tradition. So if you look at the directors of at least Hollywood heist films, from Kubrick to Jules Dassin to all the way up to Soderbergh, you see that they're all characterized by kind of independent or somewhat independent position within the industry. So that's just a few attractive features that draw me to this genre, I would say.
Gotcha. And what about you, Tim?
Well, I was always just a cinephile. I mean, I was just obsessed with movies from a young age. We're going to talk about Jean-Pierre Melville shortly, on whom I in part wrote my PhD thesis. He said that film going and film consumption were the same thing. He said cinephilia is like an all-you-can-eat buffet. He said, I just eat films all the time. So maybe that was one of the reasons why I ended up being so interested in him. But I was watching these films growing up as a kid. We only had one TV in the house, so I would watch them late at night, which is maybe how you're supposed to see film noir and policier
Sure.
films and heist movies. So I saw the Asphalt Jungle initially about 2:00 in the morning. Anyway, I was working on my PhD in Madison, Wisconsin, and became, like Luka, fascinated by points in which genre films, crime films, policiers start to mutate, and we get this fascinating crossover between commercial films and what we would think of now as auteur films. So I ended up writing my thesis on the 1950s in France and Jean-Pierre Melville, and my most vivid memories of that time are just obsessively tracking down really obscure crime films from France. This was in the mid 90s, so it was VHS on the way out, DVDs coming in. So I would go over and track down, obscure films by people like Willy Rosier, Bernard Borderie, not very well known crime filmmakers. And this is kind of a heist moment. Looking back at that now, as you asked, Andy, I remember one particular research trip where I was just literally filling my suitcase, Heist style, with as many of these movies as I could get. And I went through French customs in Paris. And obviously I was behaving in a shady manner, as academics often do. And a customs officer stopped me and asked me what the purpose of my trip was. And we were talking in French, and I think I must have hesitated in my second language. And he asked me to open my suitcase, and I did. And all these crime movies spilled out, dozens and dozens of these things. And I thought, like, this is a very odd moment to have here. But then the customs officer himself said, oh, I recognize these movies. Oh, Melville, I know that one. And actually ended up giving me recommendations of his favorite crime films from the 50s. So that was one of those points of just, and I'm European American and have spent my life shuttling between England, France, and North America, where I live and work. So that conversation has always fascinated me. The way this particular genre goes back and forward between two of the world's most important film production centers, right? Paris, France, and Hollywood and the West Coast in the US. So I love how crime film mutates. I love how heist film is one aspect of it. And I love how some of these, on the one hand, artisans, maybe uncelebrated filmmakers, alongside really notorious auteurs like Kubrick and Melville, in a strange way, are bedfellows here, aren't they? They're all working in the same registers. Just it's like an orchestra with different riffs of different notes being struck. So I've always come back to the crime film, watching these films again for this podcast. Honestly, it was like falling back in line with old friends again. I hadn't seen Rififi for a few years, and it was as fun as I always remember it. So they've always just been a part of my cinephile repertoire. And teaching French cinema in America for many years, I'm always programming these films and showing them to new audiences.
It is such a fun and engaging subgenre, and I think that's one of the reasons that I wanted to have this conversation, is because I think just the nature of heists can be so interesting in the way that they portray the criminals. Are they going to be the people that you just easily fall in love with, like the team in Ocean's 11, or are they going to be kind of like their own worst enemy in some of the films? And I think that's what's always fun to see, how they're going to play the characters in these stories. Let's talk about a little bit how, like, where this subgenre came from. In films specifically, but I know that there had been early crime stories that people had been writing in the 19th century, and then leading into the 20th century with different kind of pulp magazines and crime stories and stuff. And then we kind of had some crime films in the pre-code era, leading into kind of the gangster films. And then of course we get into kind of like everything post-war and a lot of the disillusionment, film noir, all that. How do you two see that kind of journey through just crime stories that kind of led to the much more narrow and specific heist film that we are looking at? Who wants to take that?
I can maybe try.
You want to do America and I'll do France, Luca?
Sure.
We'll meet in the middle.
Right. I think your sort of question already points to two different ways of looking at it, right? One is trying to situate it within this kind of broader genre history, right? On the one hand, of course, at least for Hollywood heist films, film noir is the kind of immediate context out of which they emerge. And there's a kind of interesting process of negotiation between this kind of emerging heist genre and the sort of logic of film noir, because the two are interested in very different ideas in many ways. And you see this kind of tension emerge, for instance, in the late 40s in the Robert Siodmak films like Criss-Cross or The Killers, for instance, where you can really observe this to sort of, heist emerging as a kind of distinct logic out of film noir.
I think that's the element that I find is fascinating, is like how it gets to that point where suddenly we really do have something that feels different, right?
Then you can sort of trace back, of course, like you mentioned, the history of the heist film back to the gangster films, kind of more general crime film genre. And then there's a kind of more specific history that you can trace, which has to do more narrowly with the depiction of the robbery, right? Uh, because the heist film really distinguishes itself by making the planning and the execution and the aftermath of the robbery such a central element of the plot and also its kind of aesthetic construction. And so you could kind of go back um, in the history of the crime film more specific and look at the examples of films that treated the robbery not just as a kind of moment in the plot, but as a kind of specific opportunity for filmmakers to develop sort of their formal experimentation or sort of aesthetic experimentation, which is something that Heist, I think, inherits. So that's kind of briefly, I think, this kind of genealogy, how I would look at it. I think.
Well, so Tim, take it from the other side. Obviously, we had the Hays Code active in Hollywood that was kind of affecting how some of these films were being created, the way these stories were being told, and everything. And from the French perspective, that's a different angle that we're also looking at here, and they were also developing these heist films, but didn't have the Hays Code. What was the difference in how that evolved over there?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, as I said in my lead-in, I've just always been fascinated by this back and forth. There's such a brilliant conversation between Hollywood movies and French films. As I always tell my students, had it not been for World War One, French films were dominating the world market up until about 1916 or so. It was, we may never have had Hollywood. Would have been Paris would, had it not been for World War One. And right back then, one of the staple outputs, very quickly, the French figure that crime films and what was already going to become known as the policier, the procedural, was just a mainstay of this. Maybe the most famous examples, which are now on Blu-ray, are the Louis Fayard crime films, things like Fantomas, Les Vampires, the vampires, T-Men, things like that. Fantomas is often hailed as a kind of precursor to Batman, interestingly enough. So one of the popular formats in France at this time is the episodic crime film. So we would get, episodic crime dramas with cliffhangers. And at this point, the stock in trade is not necessarily heist, but often robberies and, crime back and forth between, are the investigators, are the police going to catch the gangsters, things like that. Often told in very lyrical and brilliantly choreographed ways on screen. These are not just throwaway commercial products. Moving into the 30s, where things start to get interesting. I mean, couple of things, but a major film I think is Pepe Le Moko. It's very well known actually, and just a sort of gloriously of its time, but just a glorious crime film from 1937. It's well known as a Jean Gabin vehicle directed by Julien Duvivier. And this was just an internationally sensational smash hit. It was remade in Hollywood twice. Once as a musical, hilariously, once as a Charles Boyer vehicle. And this is where I think we start to see the French contribution of what were known as poetic realist films. Certainly, you can call them a precursor to film noir, but I think of it as a back and forth between the two centers, and Duvivier would work in both England and Hollywood as well. And Pepe Le Moko is about a sort of gentleman kingpin in North Africa, held up in the Casbah, and he has fled Paris. He's an expert cambrioleur, burglar, cat burglar, but we never see him carrying out any crimes because that would be too vulgar. Instead, he sits up, holed up with his friends. Everybody adores him. The police are enraptured by him. The inspector, Slimane, worships his every step, and he's safe there. But as soon as he leaves, he can't get out. He's captured. So the beginning of the film, he's done a heist, but we don't see it. We see the jewelries that have been stolen. So it's one of these aftermath of heist films. And I would say, Pepe Le Moko is maybe best remembered as Pepe Le Pew, the Warner Brothers skunk, who's not maybe aged so well, but that's one of his many descendants. It's just like the shadows of Pepe Le Moko are everywhere. So alongside that international crime film hit, which is sort of an embryonic, I like Luca's term, proto-heist films, you're getting things like Georges Simenon, the well-known crime novelist who wrote hundreds of novels. John Renoir adapts him for the first time in 1932, Night at the Crossroads. Again, we don't see a heist, but a robbery has taken place. And it's about Maigret, the infamous Jules Maigret, who's sort of a civil servant crime investigator. He's not like Sherlock Holmes. He's not aristocratic, figuring out where the loot is stashed. And it's sort of a wonderfully shot Renoir film. No one really remembers that among his works. Everyone goes to, Grand Illusion or Rules of the Game. But again, it's successful. It founds his career. And it's part of this sort of hotbed of crime film where elegant style, I would say visual style, you can see the influence, the chiaroscuro lighting, the sort of web mise en scène, the criminal network, police, gendarme, and expert gangsters who are inevitably undone, pitted against each other. You mentioned that censorship as well. Already we can see there's parallel here, but there's some divergence because French films, I would say then and now, they are more graphic about, and we saw this in the 50s as well, references to drug addiction and vice, prostitution. It's much more emphatic and candid, even, nudity in the 30s and 40s and 50s versus Hollywood. So the crime and the milieu, the environment on screen is a little bit more graphic. And I would say the biggest export maybe around this time, maybe the way the French films speak to what were then in the 40s become our classical film noir, and from there, the heist. The great classical director in France, Pierre Chenal, said, and this is sort of an infamous line, he says, it's atmosphere, literally, beautifully rendered underworld environments like in Pepe Le Moko, the Casbah itself, filthy but beautiful, ornate but decadent, these wonderful criminal environments where all our protagonists live and as they are eventually undone. So I think of them as sort of parallel environments. We've got the film noir coming in the 40s, who would sometimes, some of these makers, who would lift setups entirely from French films. I mentioned Pepe Le Moko was remade twice, but you can see the influence stylistically very clearly. And again, proto-heist is a good way of putting it. The aftermath of a burglary. It's unraveling. The tragic flaw of a hero, typically played by Jean Gabin. Popular crime literature as a backdrop to this. It's poetic realism in France, film noir in Hollywood. They're very similar, and they're sort of fishing from the same pond, I think, sometimes.
It's interesting because, one film, a much more recent film that's often included in the heist film genre is Reservoir Dogs. But like you're saying, it feels like it fits more with that, where it is kind of like a post-heist film and it's dealing with the aftermath, right? Like,
Right,
which is
right.
almost, in a way, it's almost its own little sliver of a subgenre within the heist film, where we don't see the heist, but we get to see all of the repercussions and everything they're doing afterward.
Right, we start with the crescendo, then it's just like the gradual. I mean, my own pet theory is all these heist films are about entropy. They're just inevitably, there's a finite amount of energy, a finite amount of creativity, and then inevitably things will unravel. There's one thing that goes wrong, or just the rule of the universe is that things disassemble, don't they? That things dissipate over time. Another, to your point about Reservoir Dogs, another famous French sort of quasi-heist film, Touché pas au Grisby, which belongs in this conversation, absolutely. Jacques Becker from 1954, another Jean Gabin vehicle. For 20 years, he's making crime films, either as the flawed kingpin or sometimes the investigating inspector. He would switch sides almost interchangeably in these movies. Same thing, aftermath of a robbery. They're very particular. It's 96 kilograms of gold ingots. Right, heist movies are always very particular about what they're stealing and why they're stealing those things, right? And it begins same thing with the aftermath of a robbery, and Jean Gabin's gang basically being undone because a rival gang inevitably discovers this, and it has, I guess, a spoiler of a spoiler. It ends with the car. It's in the, I would say, boot. Americans would say trunk. The gold ingots are stashed in there, and the car in a shootout explodes, and we see this just sort of glorious shot of the back of Jean Gabin turning resignation on his face, realizing as the police are arriving, he has to go. All his gold, his retirement, this beautiful heist that we've not seen, literally going up in smoke. It's very popular. It travels to the US. It's very influential. It's one of the things that gets Melville interested in crime movies. And like you mentioned with Reservoir Dogs, it's this sort of beautiful Pyrrhic ending, right?
Yeah,
The Pyrrhic ending of the heist movie of just, you win, you do this glorious thing, and then everything unravels, and you're left with this disaster. But a beautiful disaster.
Yeah, right, exactly. I think all of this is, leading to, I guess, the next part of the conversation I want to have, which is like where this really fits into what I always call the cinematic family tree. It's part of the larger crime genre. We've got law breaking, moral ambiguity is kind of a big part. We've got, as we're just discussing, kind of consequences and everything. And it's definitely distinct from other crime subgenres like the gangster films or detective stories. Although, interestingly, as we're saying, there are times where the detective story kind of melds into one of these stories, or the police officer, following them as much as we are sometimes following the criminals. But I think it, in some ways, where it falls different from other crime subgenres, I guess we can argue about how this works, but it focuses generally on a single heist, right? Like that's kind of like one thing we're mainly following. And really the emphasis is on the actual planning, execution, and aftermath of that heist, with kind of an ensemble cast. They have specialized skills. And so that's kind of like what I see where it fits as kind of its own subgenre. And then there are some, like, I don't know, are they subgenres of the subgenre? I know we had gone back and forth about possibly including the hot rock on the list, and then when I rewatched it, I'm like, it is kind of a caper film. It's because it's lighthearted. I'm like, is it a heist or is it a caper film? Ocean's 11, we could kind of say the same thing there. There are kind of like neo-noir types of heists. We move as we progress, we move into like much more of the high-tech heist type of story, which has kind of become its own subgenre. And then we also love throwing in period heists. What do you two see as like other elements of this that really kind of help define this as its own subgenre? Like what makes the crime film or the heist film the heist film? Luka?
I think it's a tricky question, partly for the reason that I indicated earlier, which is that the heist appears in this moment of transition, away from the kind of stability of the classical Hollywood genre system, into the new Hollywood period that sort of gets formed later in the late 60s and the 70s, where sort of Hollywood sort of reorganizes itself both institutionally, economically, but also aesthetically in terms of the genres or what it does with genre in a way. So it's a kind of, in terms of placing it at a tree, it's kind of between the two trees. It's like, it's the genre that emerges when one tree is falling down and another one is sort of beginning to grow or something like that.
Interesting. Yeah.
And, some, people who write about the heist, for instance, point out that on the one hand, it's very, it's a kind of iconic thing. It's easily recognizable. It's a kind of, it's everybody knows a heist film when one sees a heist film. But then as some film scholars point out, it never really manages to establish a kind of stable syntax or a kind of stable structure as a genre as well. Which would go, Andy, with your sort of calling it a subgenre rather than a genre proper or something like that. So it's
right.
It's got this instability too, which you kind of captured by saying how it can go in all these different directions, or it has all these variations. So maybe I'll just, one genre that I think is adjacent to heist, or that one should think about in relationship to the heist. It's not necessarily part of the larger crime category, but I would say that, for instance, the war film, in particular the World War II war combat film, is a kind of genre adjacent to heist, or I think useful to think about it in relationship to the Hollywood heist emergence around 1950, because the war film and the war combat film, share something with the heist, which I think is fundamental, which is the group as the protagonist. You don't really get that in the crime genre so much, which are typically more individualistic narratives. And so I think that there's a certain one way to think about the heist is a kind of synthesis or a kind of cross-fertilization between crime, film noir genre, and the war film or the war combat film, where you could compare the heist collective, the heist group, the group of thieves, as a kind of platoon, basically, that, they're a group, they're a collective, their action involves entering the enemy territory to perform some kind of seemingly impossible, heroic action, and so on. And that would be another dimension of this kind of instability or the kind of inherent hybridity of the heist film, I would say.
I like
Tim? Yeah.
the word instability is good, Luca. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I would maybe even put alongside it the word permeable. I think one of the appeals, I mean, as I mentioned in France, and this is obviously true in America as well, we've always had crime films. I mean, they've always been just the backdrop of the commercial sector. There's an insatiable appetite for them. And I'm never, as a film historian, I'm always curious with commercial cinema's crossover with more art house cinema. And I think, I mean, the two leading examples, two of our notorious band here, Kubrick's The Killing and Bob the Gambler by Melville. I mean, parallel moments in evolving industries, as you mentioned, Luca. I think one of the things that draws those two, Kubrick at that point in New York primarily, moving to Europe eventually, and Melville in Paris, but obsessed with Hollywood. I mean, he's an American in Paris. They are both looking at the crime film as it's newly popularized, and they're looking at these, I would say, hot-wired conventions by that point. Andy, you mentioned the Hays Code, crime must not pay. Well, it does, but only in the short term, right? And it leads to this spectacular unraveling. And you've got sort of classical continuity, and think of this as just like classical screenwriting boiled down to a sort of perfect commercial formula. Noticed by the 50s, we're referring to the quote unquote characters in heist movies by just their job title, the hoodlum, the safecracker, the sharpshooter. And sometimes Melville will even just not even have actual human names. They're just roles. So on the one hand, the commercial aspect is boiling down to this sort of perfect balance. But if you think of commercial cinema like a kind of orchestra, what proto-auteurs like Kubrick and Melville are looking at is how can I fetishize or bring out or stylize certain aspects of that repertoire, one of which obviously is the robbery act itself. How can I make that more flamboyant? That's the set piece, the literal and figurative showstopper, right? And in so doing, make my fingerprints clear. Francois Truffaut of the New Wave to Come, who are looking on at these films in France and Hollywood very closely, and seeing in them the means to individual self-expression. So it's like there's a tipping point. There's the commercial viability of the genre. These are films you can make cheaply and quickly. There's a built-in audience for them. And then in enter stage left, Kubrick and Melville, I can stylize, right? I can fetishize aspects of this. When Melville's voiceover comes at the beginning of the, beautiful film Bob the Gambler, and I won't do the voice, but voici quelqu'un record, that the bass, the booming Melville tones there. It's like, it's my film, I'm the auteur, and crucially, I know what's going to happen, as frankly do most of the audience by this point. But same thing with Kubrick's stylization. Some of his visual style on screen is very aggressive foregrounds, flamboyant point of view shots, longer takes sometimes. You can see someone who is self-consciously saying, I want people to notice me. I'm the maker here. And the French New Wave would come to say, these are auteurs. This is, quote unquote, important cinema. This is where commercial film recedes and high art begins. But it's right in the cutting point of heist films here, which I find fascinating. And it's a way in which you can see genres in many different ways, genres and subgenres. I like your point of family tree, Andy. But it's a way in which as well, for the enterprising cinephile filmmaker who wants to be like Alfred Hitchcock by the 50s. Well, I can do it in a single film because I can take the crime film, I can stylize it. And you could just see heist films are useful because I can make that point so stunningly idiosyncratic. Again, think of that, the shot in silence with just score, the hypothetical flash forward of the heist at the Deauville Casino in Bob the Gambler. And you could see this is Melville asserting his credentials as a self-conscious, self-reflexive filmmaker, but it's also popular materials. He's just raised the intensity. Going back to my orchestra analogy, he's just got one section of the orchestra playing a lot louder than all of the other ones. So that set piece moment, the heist film, the pleasures of this, I can just take away some of the other elements and just foreground that. So I'll give you 15 minutes, 20 minutes, the Rififi, the famous sequence there. So it's sort of a perfect backdrop for an enterprising new generation. Like Luka said, classicism, studio filmmaking receding, independent auteurs, more flamboyant cinephiles emerging. It's sort of a changing of the guard moment here, and we get these just wonderful films that are just generic, but not generic in a fun way.
It's funny, the way that you were describing that made me actually think of like the criminals who actually performed these robberies and the police, and how the criminals are always having to be more creative to come up with something that can get past whatever new technology is out there, whether it's a new safe design or new alarm systems or different security types of patrols, whatever the case may be. And then the police are catching up and going, well, now we have to beat that because that person has topped us with that technology. And that's kind of like the perpetual chase that you always hear about with criminals and cops. And it's kind of the same thing that we get in the stories here. The filmmakers, the storytellers are always trying to come up with, well, what's a really creative way that we can do a heist that makes this work? I know, let's drill through the ceiling or the floor into the ceiling below. We'll lower an umbrella to catch all the material so nothing falls on the ground. Like, it's just genius. But then it's like, well, now they're going to come up with solutions for that. So then by the time we're getting to things like Inside Man, it's like, I know, let's build an entire new back wall of this room so that we can actually hide somebody in here for weeks. And I think that's what's kind of another exciting element. And just like the filmmakers, right? And that's, I think, speaks to it. Like, the filmmakers are always like, when they're young and excited about like, what can I do that's new for this medium to really show off my skills? And it's just like the criminal masterminds putting these heists together.
I really like that point. I would say as well, Andy, like what we're both talking about here is a celebration of virtuosity, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's
right.
like creative virtuosity for its own sake. And just as a side note to what Luka was talking about earlier in terms of, adjacent genres, I would put very close to these films, especially starting in the 50s, the musical. I mean, going back to Rififi, as we all should do, it's an amazing film. Before the famous extended heist scene, 23 minutes with no dialogue, right?
Yeah.
Just before that starts, there's a performance of the song. Rififi is a song. It's many things. It's a slang term for a sort of a scuffle or a ruckus, but it's also a song. And Magali Noel, who performs this in this sort of black catsuit just before the heist, she starts to sing in a nightclub. She's improvising, and as she sings, the xylophone player joins in. There's a drummer, there's a pianist. So again, the orchestra analogy. And from that, we go to the heist. And as you're talking about, umbrellas and muted drills, and Jules Dassin, who plays Cesar the Safecracker, wears ballet shoes remarkably in that sequence. He's literally a sort of dancer. They swing down on a rope from the ceiling. It's as if the film is blurring a musical number with glorious silhouettes on the wall. The first time we see Magali Noel sing, sort of proto James Bond sequence there. Musical performance, virtuosity, everyone like an orchestra improvising, joining in their roles, playing an instrument, cracking a safe. And as you're saying, Andy, it's all about keeping ahead of new technology. You look at heist films from the 50s, like Bob the Gambler has a great one where there's the device to sort of, it's like the sort of X-ray machine. They're doing a sonogram of the safe to crack this, venerable classic safe. There's always some new technology aspect to it, but it's also just about, sure, they've got these gadgets, right? They've got these devices, ridiculously long drills, foam from fire extinguishers to nullify alarm systems. But I would say it's more about the physical prowess. Like music, it's sort of a performative aspect, isn't it? They're all doing these things in sync. Again, I just that heist in Rififi is so wonderful, of them knowing what the other one needs. So sweat is breaking out, it's going to get in his eyes, mop, mop, mop. Right? It's
Yeah.
like surgery, another analogy. But
Yeah,
they're all
sure,
doing these
sure.
roles in perfect alignment, one step ahead of the law at that point in this, crescendo set piece, like a song.
Yeah, yeah. Luca, do you have any comments on all that?
Yeah, I mean, this is wonderful. The only thing I would add, I mean, I fully agree with this description of the heist as both a, criminal action, but it's also artistry. It's basically a kind of aesthetic act. The heist is a work of art. And I think it's interesting to think about this kind of depiction of action, or this kind of act emerging in the 50s, sort of in the kind of period of high Fordism, of like encroaching automation, a very, where work in the economy or in society is becoming very, very different than what's depicted in a heist film. So there's a kind of utopian dimension to the heist, a kind of depiction of work, collective labor as it could be, for instance, or is maybe in brief moments of a kind of artistic activity it is, but not generally so in kind of high Fordist capitalist societies, for instance. So there's what you guys were describing. I think it's both an heist as the allegory of art, as the allegory of filmmaking, but also as utopia, basically. It's a kind of utopian depiction of people being able to exist together against the kind of alienating, atomizing society, basically, that they are, entering as a kind of enemy territory, which is another significance of the technology that you were describing. Technology, when it's not used in a kind of virtuosic way or aesthetically, it's alienating, right? It's the thing that sort of captures us and subordinates us, basically. Whereas in the heist, it's always about sort of turning it around,
Yeah, right. I want to jump into kind of, I found this list online. Charles Kunken, had done a breakdown of heist films and came up with a list of 16 components. I just wanted to kind of go through these as far as like how important we think that they are to the heist film subgenre. I think it's an interesting list. Some of it, I think, makes more sense than others, but I just wanted to get a read as we try to figure out like what is it that really is kind of making a heist film. So I'm just going to read through this list and then we can chat about it. So number 1, a story about a single score. We've already talked about that. Number 2, the perpetrator is the hero or the protagonist of the film. Number 3, the hero always wants to steal things. Number 4, the heist must be a success. Number 5, the hero gets the want and the need. Number 6, there's a twist ending. Number 7, recruitment of the ensemble. Number 8, the ensemble has interesting eclectic expertise. I like that one. Number 9, collection of heist tools are scattered throughout the plot. Number 10, the target is personified. That's an interesting one. And number 11, the cat is personified as far as like the cat and mouse game that we're creating here. Number 12, there are iconic scenes. Number 13, there's a clever and interesting heist sequence. Number 14, there's a good enough B plot. Number 15, characters we love. And number 16, part of the plan is hidden from the audience. Now, I think specifically, Charles talked about using film specifically, I think Ocean's 11 and I think that it was the 1999 remake of the Thomas Crown Affair as kind of the two specific ones that he used to kind of put this list together. But I think it's an interesting starting place for this. So how does this play for you? Are there items on here that you feel are absolutely essential, or the things that you say, I don't think that's quite as critical? Do you want to jump in, Luca? What do you think?
I'll jump in. I would maybe, I think mostly, this makes sense. I think a couple that I would have some questions about maybe this idea that the heist must be a success. I mean, because I think in some sense this excludes the noir heists of the 50s and the examples that also Tim was talking about earlier. Films in which the robbery itself might be a success, but the problem arises precisely when the object needs to be circulated, or which needs to be sort of which I think is a very kind of interesting dimension of the heist genre. This idea that the robbery produces or comes up with this object of a kind of exceptional value that's too much in some sense. It can simply become an object of exchange again, and leads to a kind of tragic downfall of the robber. So the question of success and failure, I think the genre thinks about it in more complicated ways, I think, than simply saying it has to be a success or not. In a way, I think you could even read the heist genre as trying to pose the question of success and failure in more fundamental, sort of more radical ways than we typically tend to understand those terms. And then the other one is this idea that the target needs to be personified, which I don't think is necessarily the case, because part of what gives the heist, at least in my view, the heist genre, its charm is precisely this group of people trying to enter this impersonal, anonymous, institutional territory, which is, against them, not because this opposition is personified, but simply because of the way it functions as a kind of apparatus, or even a kind of architecture, or kind of system into which they have to enter and extract from it by learning about it, also, mapping it in order to be able to subvert it in some sense. So for me, the kind of confrontation of the human group, or the group of thieves, with an impersonal environment that's inimical in a way, is also part of the charm of the genre. So I would say that it doesn't have to be personified, and that maybe personification of the um, um, enemy, or the kind of the villain figure in this case, in the heist genre, is maybe at times also a weakness in some sense. So I would say, so those would be the two sort of conventions here that I would maybe question, or sort of raise as a question.
Gotcha.
I think.
Gotcha.
I like these conventions. It's always fascinating when people try to map it out and say, here it is, this qualifies.
Yeah,
And this takes us back, remember, of course, to Jean-Pierre Melville himself, who is watching very closely the arrival of things like the Asphalt Jungle, and actually quantifies this in his notes as he starts to interview, because he's, on the basis of Bob the Gambler and the Samurai and others, wants to promote himself as an auteur. And he says there are particular variations. He has 19 in the Asphalt Jungle. So everyone has always been doing this. As long as there's been film noir, going back to film noir in the 40s, Bourd and Chaumeton's famous encyclopedia, they're trying to quantify it. Like, why is that a film noir and that's not?
Yeah,
it's like the old line, I think Luca paraphrased this earlier. I think Eric Barno said this about documentary. I couldn't necessarily formulate one, but I know one when I see one. It's a little like this here. I would maybe add to some of these, I think there's a gendered aspect to it as well, which we've seen with newer films. Widow's most iconically maybe of finally that being inverted in contemporary films, of female-centered heist films. They are about male community. Sometimes you do see there's a bit of a bedrock of some misogyny back in the 50s, but it's about male community. It's about a tragic flaw. It's about one tiny error that, with my entropy aspect, one thing that leads to the unraveling. Like in Rififi, César has this weakness for women, which is another recurrent refrain. So when they're exiting, the jeweler's there, Mappin and Webster there, he gets one ring that will identify where the diamonds have come from, and the whole, again, entropic unraveling begins. So one of those male characters has to break that group dynamic typically, right? They'll let slip something, they'll divulge it maybe to a duplicitous woman, female character, and then the community essentially turns on itself. So there's a gendered aspect to it as well. I'd also say, I think one of the things for me that really, as far back as, and this starts in the 50s and has never really gone away in heist movies, for me, they are about capitalism. And looking back at this timeline, right? Asphalt Jungle 1950, Rififi 55, Killing and Bob the Gambler 56. In France, and this is true in America, this is an economic boom period. Right? In France, they call this the 30 années glorieuses, the 30 glorious years in which economic prosperity nominally is up, right? The economy is growing in France every year for 30 years in a row. The question is, who's seeing that money? And the backdrop of these police series is often these sort of marginal areas. Maybe it's New York City. It's certainly Northwest Montmartre in Paris. People who are not feeling those benefits, right? So it's about capitalism. It's about the desperation of people who are driven to the precipice, or their fatal flaw is they can't stop. They need one last robbery and then they can retire, like
Yeah.
Bob or Tony. So it's sort of boiling down that, like, I must have money. One beautifully engineered thing, get rich quick. I'll see the benefits that the one percenters are enjoying by the 60s and the 70s. And obviously it never works. And I think
Yeah.
maybe part of the backdrop of this, as well as the viewer's role, we look on, we are enraptured, we're delighted by the prowess, by the crime virtuosity, but maybe there's an aspect of, how shall I put it tactfully, enjoying the unraveling as well, right? Of the, we enjoy the rise, we enjoy the fall, I think, as viewers. So I guess there's some aspects to the dynamics, the plotting. I guess, in sum, I think heist films, like most venerable genres, like westerns, like musicals, although crime films and heist films have had an even longer archaeology than those, it's fluid. It's a continuum. You could say, here's a crime film over here. Here's this is a heist film over here. And there's a lot of connective tissue. So it's fun to plot them out, but I never think you quite nail it, because you can always think of an outlier. There's always some rogue film that has some aspects, or frankly, there's someone like Kubrick or Melville plotting, thinking, I've seen all these movies. I'm going to cite and draw on them, but I'm going to put in one element you've never seen before. Like
Yeah.
Bob the Gambler, the director will comment and interject and say, here's how the heist will work. And then, oh no, actually bait and switch. It's this other thing they're doing instead, right? So it's never stable.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I think it's valuable. And again, going back to what we were saying earlier, like that's part of what we want to see as an audience, is like, what is the new thing that is going to be injected into this story that I haven't seen before? Like that's such a key part of it, and I think that's one of the things that always makes them so enjoyable to watch, is to see, like, how are they going to get away with it this time? How will Danny Ocean steal from 3 casinos? It's like it makes that whole thing play, and I think that's part of the magic of why we like to watch these films, and I think why filmmakers like to tell them, because it's like this puzzle that they're all also trying to put together, and like, how can we write this in a way that actually kind of makes sense, And I mean, I know, like, when you look at Michael Mann, he's like, how can I'm going to talk to the real criminals and show it how they really do this, and so we're getting kind of the real version of it. But then you're also seeing other people coming up with stuff that's just like, yeah, let's steal this giant mechanical thing that will knock out an entire city, because that's going to be a key part of our plot. And you can get pretty fanciful with some of the elements, but I think, they write it in a way where we buy it. And I think that's what makes them so much fun to watch. I want to, over this next part of our conversation, we're going to talk about our 10 films that we have here. And I want to use this as an opportunity to look at kind of the evolution of the heist film, from kind of what we're calling like the essentially the origins, like Asphalt Jungle, Rififi in the 50s, leading all the way through to today. Over the course of this conversation, we are going to be discussing 10 films that we've kind of put together as a list that are great examples of a heist film. Again, far from a complete list. There are many other ones out there that are worth watching. Both Tim and Luka have provided additional lists that I will include in the show notes of other heist films that are worthy of checking out. For the conversation, 5 of the films will be part of the main show, and the other 5 will be included in the member bonus conversation. The 10 films we're going to be discussing are The Asphalt Jungle, Rififi, The Killing, Bob Le Flambeur, Le Cercle Rouge, The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, Thief, Ocean's 11, Inside Man, and Widows. If you'd like to hear the full conversation and learn more about membership to the Next Reel family of film podcasts, visit truestory.fm/join. That's TRUSTORY.fm/join. Okay, so let's jump into the 1950s. Establishment of this subgenre with The Asphalt Jungle in 1950, Rififi 1955. We also have moving into The Killing in 1956, Bob Le Flambeur in 1956. We're really starting to see these films taking place. And again, film noir, very much an influence of what's going on with film noir and post-war disillusionment. And I suppose you could say, like, there's a sense of realism at this point with the way that they're being portrayed. Let's focus on the Asphalt Jungle first. This just a quick synopsis: 1950, directed by John Huston. In this classic heist film, a group of small-time criminals led by the recently released convict Dix Handley and mastermind Doc Riedenschneider plan and execute a jewelry robbery. The heist itself is successful, but the aftermath leads to a series of double crosses and tragic consequences for those involved. This is Luka, you had kind of mentioned that it really is kind of a film noir, but it's also setting up what we're getting out of the heist films, the criminal underworld, the setting up of the team and the actual robbery itself, all of those elements, and including like the technology that they have to figure out how to get through. Um, what what else about this film really kind of makes this stand out, like saying, hey, I am making a mark here as something new?
Right. So I think, one of the things that the film takes from film noir is what you could call a kind of noir situation or noir world, which you, Andy, have described as that of a kind of disillusionment, post-war disillusionment. Or you could also think about it as, it's in the title of the film. It's the Asphalt Jungle. It's this kind of world in which social bonds are dissolving, basically. It's a kind of world of war of all against all. And one of the questions for the heist becomes, how might some kind of collective project be possible in that kind of world? And there's a kind of remarkable solidarity that emerges between the two protagonists, Dix Handley and Doc Riedenschneider, who come from very different environments. They're very different contexts. And yet in the context of the heist, there's, for a brief period of time, a kind of bond that's formed against the background of this noir world in which social bonds are dissolving, which is a world that's basically a jungle. But I think that what distinguishes it from film noir is the fact that you have precisely a kind of group protagonist, right? The film noir is traditionally focused on an individual protagonist who undergoes a kind of encounter with fate. Something in their past has happened that's too much for them to bear, or that comes to haunt them in the present and eventually leads to their downfall. And Heist really does not play with fate in the same way, which you can sort of notice by the fact that the heist films, even noir heist films, largely drop the kind of famous element of the film noir, which is the voiceover narration, the kind of backward-looking voiceover narration, which really is not so much part of the heist film as a genre. Even when the voiceover appears, it's not exactly the same kind of voiceover as you encounter in film noir. So there's a different notion of, first of all, there's a group protagonist, and there's a different relationship to chance and contingency than that of film noir, which sort of inscribes chance and contingency, the accident that happens that makes everything unravel under some kind of larger category of fate, basically. In the heist, you have a much more direct encounter with contingency as pure contingency, pure chance, pure accident. It's a probabilistic universe rather than a kind of destiny-driven universe that you still find in film noir, for instance.
Tim, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, clearly this is a game-changing film. We know this because Jean-Pierre Melville tells us it is. In his history of American cinema, he says this is the moment when everything crystallizes, and it becomes this sort of motherlode text for Melville and so many others. I mean, genuinely, this is I mentioned Pepe Le Moco, but you look in film history, Your Family Tree again, Andy, it's like this is one of the most influential films of all time. It really is. I want to just move 2 years earlier to it, just as an aside.
Yeah.
John Huston's preceding film, 1948, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, another sort of classical film. Humphrey Bogart, Walter Brennan, Tim Holt. And it has this very famous ending, if I may spoil the spoiler again, in which it's shot in Mexico, because the backdrop here is independent productions, more location shooting in the US, so we can go out on the streets now, increasingly in the late 1940s onwards. And Treasure of the Sierra Madre notoriously ends with this group of prospectors, this mock male group that's come together for a quest, for a mission, get rich quick in the hills, mining gold, like literally pulling it out of the ground. It's so easy to do. They turn on each other, jealousy intensifies, tragic flaws amplified, and the film ends with a rival gang stealing what they've done, their gold dust, opening it up, and what just wonderful American cinema shot. The gold dust flapping away in the wind, lost forever, and they think it's just dust. And famously, the group fall around laughing at the sort of hideous irony of all this wasted, beautiful action come to nothing. And this, again, Pyrrhic ending, which I think just underwrites a lot of John Huston's work and certainly informs the Asphalt Jungle and the heist film Forever After. So that's not a heist film, but it's the same action. Come together, flawed male community, particular skills combined. Together they are everything. Divided, they fall apart. And this sort of flamboyant finale in which it's all literally up in smoke. Also, as well, just picking up on something that Luka was saying about these films' really ambivalent attitude towards cities. The consensus is that no one really knows where the Asphalt Jungle is shot. It's an unnamed, probably Midwestern city. It seems just all cities and none at the same time. And again, I'm just looking at endings, particularly with no disrespect to those who haven't seen it. It ends with Dix going back to his childhood horse stables, which is this extraordinary moment. Rural backwaters are seldom glimpsed in film noir, seldom in heist films. And it's this idea about, this is also about, I mentioned the economics of these films, about the growth of cities in the 1950s, increasingly populations who are urbanized, working sometimes anonymous, quite unfulfilling jobs. In this film, like I think all of its descendants, we get these glimpses of quiet, rather humdrum lives being lived, of quite sort of, these are not glamorous apartment buildings. The mise-en-scène is quite decrepit. There's already decay in these cities. And then you get, again, this great ironic Huston ending. All I want to do is go back to my childhood horse farm, which of course I can't do. I go back there as, blood is leaching out of me, and I've got moments left dying on the ground as these horses, cavort around. Also, as well, I just like one line I'd like to tease out, which for me is like, this is that motherlode moment of it, is one of these great supporting performances, Jean Hagen. We all remember her from Singing in the Rain, musical and heist films, Neighbors again, of her alongside Dick Sterling Hayden. And towards the end of the film, as she's desperately trying, take me with you. I'll help you. I'll help you drive. We know he's bleeding out at this point. And Sterling Hayden turns, and so many great performances he gives in this period. He's a sort of heist protagonist par excellence here. And she's facing camera. He's right behind her, and he almost in rage and frustration and just, I don't understand. He screams out, he says, I just don't get it. So there's this notion of why would a woman sacrifice for him? He has no conception that she loves him and just, wants to be with him, but it's absolutely impossible, right? And it's just this sort of gender incompatibility here. Gene Hagen's maybe about as good as it gets in these rather male-centric classical heist movies. But for me, that moment of just men and women are just, ships passing in the night at best. At worst, she will betray him in other kind of films. But that moment of just, we are speaking different languages. This is a male world, and women are encroaching on it at best or destroying it at worst. But, you can go through the whole movie is just, there's so many lovely moments like that, iconic distillations. I love as well, heist movies are about tragic flaws. They are, dare I say it, commercialist tragedies, aren't they? Right? That the great moment of Dix, who is the sophisticated, wealthy string puller, who is undone just because he's driving to Cleveland to get away, stops in a diner with his taxi driver there, and there's a young teenage girl dancing to a jukebox. He gives him nickels, right? That's like the proceeds of the robbery as much as you'll ever get to live to spend them. And just puts on a song and just watches her dance. The cops arrive, and he actually has that brilliant line of, "How long, how long have you been here? Like, at what point was I done for?" And they say, "Oh, just a few minutes," as in the length of that song. So that, that sort of beautiful, poetic, kind of ghastly male flaw of just, I can't not watch her dance, and that's it for me. And it's just, dozens more. The Asphalt Jungle just has these wonderfully iconic. We'll see them reappear over and over again.
You can see in the two protagonists of the Asphalt Jungle the embodiments of the two different genres. And Sterling Hayden's character is, in some sense, the embodiment of a film noir in a way.
Yeah.
Right? He's haunted by this past that he wants to return to, but of course, as soon as he can only return to it at the price of his death, basically, at the end of the film.
Right,
Whereas
right.
Doc Riedenschneider is the figure of the heist, the kind of
Yeah.
mastermind crime figure, who has a completely different relationship to his past. I mean, he tells Dix at some point, "You can always go home. It's nothing." Right? Basically, they give up this kind of nostalgic noir idea of the past, and throw yourself into this kind of probabilistic adventure of the future if you can. Of course, Dix can't do it, but the fact that they're both given kind of equal part in the film makes this, I think, the moment in which the heist film really sort of breaks off from film noir proper and establishes its own sort of logic, or at least this logic becomes visible. This, which it might have been inchoate in the kind of the Siodmak films of the late 40s, but in Huston's film, the heist and the noir become two different existential sort of projects, if you want. I mean, Huston was influenced by existentialism and by Sartre and so on. And the two characters sort of embody film noir and the heist film as two distinct sort of existential choices, or two distinct sort of ways to be in the world. And they kind of come together in solidarity. They like each other, they care about each other, and then they kind of go their separate ways. But I think that helps to establish the heist film as a kind of distinct, in separation from film noir, a kind of distinct logic, if you want.
And just as a quick, sorry,
Yeah.
Andy, just a quick footnote to that, I would piggyback on what Luka was just saying. A father-son relationship is very important here as well. And I think that's a distinctly heist aspect we see, perhaps born, although there are precursors. And I'd go back to Pepe Le Moco, where a similar thing occurs. But Doc and Dix, this sort of quasi-father-son, older male, younger male, mentoring, certain care and intimacy. And it's remarkable. If Sterling Hayden cannot speak the same language as Jean Hagen, or any other woman for that matter, in the heist film, there is this, genuine bond between the two men. They care about each other. They want what's best for each other. They sacrifice for each other. And what's interesting as well is that towards the end of the film, Dix, just gives him his money. It's like suddenly, if everything is about money, about get rich quick, one score and you're set for life, you can go back to your horse farm or whatever. He at that point, money is not what bonds these two men, this quasi father son. It's something more than that. And I think that will run throughout almost all heist movies. Maybe this belongs on that list of tropes. It's very common. An impromptu father-son, maybe as a reflection, as Luka said earlier, of just a total absent home life or some terrible past, or just very flawed men that they have not had that nurturing influence. It forms as part of the group, as part of the coming together for the robbery.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I also just wanted to add a note about, like, you were mentioning the probabilistic nature of these, Luka, and there's a moment in this film where after Dix hits a security guard, the gun falls and happens to shoot. It was already cocked and loaded, and it shoots and it hits him. And I think that's an interesting element that we can look at through the probabilistic lens, the probability of a gun hitting the ground and shooting and hitting him, or the fated nature of it, which might also feel more noir. And I think there's an interesting element to that moment that you could see play either way in this particular film.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right, because you could read it as Dix reads it, which would be the fateful way.
Yeah.
Or as Doc Riedenschneider reads it, which would be the kind of
Just the
probabilistic
Yeah.
rationalist way, right? Because he says he has this like line when after he gets hit by the cop, right? He has this line. He says, you can plan everything, and then some chance will happen.
yeah
So
Yes.
some
He
thing,
uses
right.
the word, I think,
it's not the idea of fate, right? He's a pure rationalist, right?
Yeah.
And still you can plot out the universe in a rationalist way, and still chance remains. There is a kind of irreducible element of contingency and chance that Doc knows about. Whereas Dix, the Sterling Hayden character, reads everything in terms of his sort of fate,
Yeah.
which is a very different kind of perspective on the world, a very different kind of existential choice in a way that he
Right.
makes.
Yeah. Yeah.
and,
That's
and part of the
fascinating. Yeah.
pleasure of he uses the word accident, doesn't he? I think he says it it's like
He says blind accident. He
Yeah.
says
yes, it's
blind
just like
accident.
the
Yeah.
best laid plans of mice and men, right? Of just like
Yeah.
something will always go wrong, and we watch this almost. We'll talk about this further about the very gallows sense of humor in heist films as well, especially in this first run of American films have a very complicated relationship with firearms being dropped on the ground, right? Sometimes they go off, sometimes they don't. There's a kind of weird logic or illogic to them.
Exactly.
And the idea that that gun would land on the ground and shoot him in the stomach, because
Yeah.
stomach is generically prescribed long, drawn out, suffering,
Slow, yeah.
tragic male death, typically, isn't it? But it is that moment, almost, I would, to double down on your citation, I think rightly, of existentialism, Luca, of it's sort of absurdism as well, isn't it? That there will be that one thing, that monkey wrench, no matter, you cannot control everything, much as Doc and others like him will try to,
Yeah.
something will always go wrong. And sometimes it is absolutely ludicrous. And there's almost a kind of absurdist sense of humor about like that one moment, everything unravels because of that.
That one thing. Yeah. Let's move on to Rififi. This is Jules Dassin's film from 1955. In this influential French heist film, Tony, a recently released gangster, reunites with his old crew to plan and execute a daring jewelry store robbery. The film is famous for its intricate, nearly half-hour-long heist sequence, which is executed without dialogue or music. Fantastic film. We've already brought it up a number of times. And it's taking a step up from like what we had just been talking about with the Asphalt Jungle. And we've got like a solid team of specialists. We also are dealing with, again, kind of like these flawed moments with these characters. And we're seeing how all of this plays out in this one. So I mean, you're our French expert, Tim. What is it about this one? We've talked about it quite a bit already, but like, what else about this makes it just such a seminal heist film?
I'm here to represent the French. Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of, along with the Asphalt Jungle, it's one of just the most watched, the most studied, and the most copied and imitated. References to this one pop up everywhere. It's like Le Samurai, the Jean Melville descendant. It's just, there's something to it. I think it's probably, I could be wrong, but it's probably the most virtuoso set piece. I think what Dassin is doing very self-consciously, again, self-consciousness is key, is highlighting, fetishizing the robbery act itself, right? Where does poetic realism or film noir recede and the heist film cycle take off? It's probably this sort of fetishistic, stylistic amplification of just the action of the robbery. And just I would again bring in the musical aspects. I talked about this earlier about the title, the number which precedes this robbery, but just the way in which the men function together as a kind of ensemble. There are lots of references here and elsewhere to jazz music. Control. What is jazz music? It's sort of controlled improvisation, isn't it? It's riffs,
right.
motifs, instruments, coming together. One, we'll get trumpet for a bit, then we'll get drums. That analogy is very clear. I'd also say as well, it's just the beauty of casting. We talked a bit about Sterling Hayden already. Jean Servais, just like Roger Duchesne in Bob the Gambler, which we'll get to. No disrespect, but maybe classical actors slightly past their prime might be an objective way of describing it. Jean Servais had been making dozens of films since the 30s. Suffer from alcoholism and had become, to certain eyes and industrial sources, almost unemployable Dassin making a very low budget independent film. These are low budget independent movies we're talking about here, which gives you some flexibility, especially in France. Casting veteran performers, some of whom knew each other off set. So there is that kind of, I think, camaraderie and badinage among the leading players. And as we're watching, Jean Servais coughing and struggling and, clearly physically under duress for almost all the film, apart from the heist, because there he's in his element, underwrites the way in which the film works. I mean, I would just say as well, we should focus on, why are heist films so long-lived? Why are crime films so long-lived? Because people love them. Good question always to ask, why do we love the things we love so much in movies and elsewhere? I'd say, for me, Rififi pares down some of just the pleasures of popular films, beautifully made and executed to its core. I mean, look at that central heist. It's literally about a group of men who are getting from, I'll point on my screen, from here to there. And that's it for half an hour. Right? Melville will run with this ball of just, it's so simple, it's so elegant, and it is, going back to our list of 16 conventions, some of these things we know they're going to do in advance, others we see as they are doing them. And tie this into here's a left field reference, watching the great English Bake Off, watching reality television where it involves expertise. We as viewers love to watch these things. I don't care what genre or cycle of popular entertainment is, TV shows, movies, anything. Rififi shows us this, right? We start a drill, it's too loud, so we muffle it, right? Beads of sweat on brow, someone mops it like a surgeon. It's absolutely perfectly syncopated action of male characters we know are beforehand and afterwards, they're a mess. They're washed up, they're flawed, they are past their prime, whatever it is. But in this moment, it's perfection. It's a kind of spectacle or stage show. There's another reason why so many of the French heist movies take place in and around Montmartre, because this is, where the Moulin Rouge is. This is where stage shows are. The heist is a kind of stage performance here. And, I would just add as well, one of the pleasures for me watching these films again and again, showing them to my students who almost invariably love them too, is the bone dry sense of humor about these films. I do like the bit at the beginning of the heist when they get into the room above the jewelry shop, and there's the concierge there, the couple,
Right.
and they restrain them in an elegant way because there's no guns in this. Tony's very clear about this. Guns, they're sort of vulgar, right? We want elegance here. They subdue the two of them, and they're in the chair. We get the shot, and they both squirm, and they make that they're crying out. They're trying to attract attention, and the men go shh. And immediately they comply and they just sit there mutely. And for me, it's, Dassin's bone dry sense of humor of we're not going to talk right now, right? There's no human noise. And one last thing about why this film, I think, is so influential and so sort of beautiful in its fashion is just the way it's like Bicycle Thieves. It's like a city symphony film of the 1930s. As the heist goes on, we cut outside to Paris throughout the night. Location shooting. It's so atmosphere is the term again. Remember Pierre Chanel, atmosphere. We get, postmen delivering posts, mailmen going about their business, street cleaners, inevitably the gendarme. And it's just this sort of panoply of people working. And in the heist film, in that jewelry shop for that glorious 23 minutes, it's like workers' play.
They're
right?
also
They are
working,
they're working, but it's this sort of beautifully self-contained moment of male community, everybody at their fluent best, and we know it will be unraveled as César, who is of course the director, so a little self-conscious wit, with that one flawed action. I'll steal that ring because I want to impress the woman who sings the title song. Give her that ring, everything will unravel from there. But for me, it's just like that. It's like all the pleasures of popular cinema condensed into 23 minutes. It's just kind of glorious.
Yeah, it's a fantastic film, and it really speaks to the nature of heist films. You can see why it is such a critical one to have on this list. Let's jump into Stanley Kubrick's The Killing from 1956. In this non-linear heist film, Johnny Clay orchestrates a complex racetrack robbery with a group of skilled criminals. Despite the perfect planning, the heist unravels due to the interference of a corrupt cop and the betrayal of Clay's associate, George, leading to a violent and tragic conclusion. Luka, this one is, I think, such a fun and interesting one, and seeing Kubrick tackling it, I think, it's always great watching anything by Kubrick. But I think that there's the nature of kind of the non-linear storytelling with this one, I think is just such an interesting way to tackle it. And also tied into the non-linear nature is the specific timing that we're getting throughout, which seems to tie in so much to the nature of planning something like this, right?
The first thing that's remarkable about the Kubrick film is just how short it is, and how he manages to pack all of this into basically what's 80 minutes or something like that.
Yeah.
It's a kind of infernal machinery of plotting, basically, that he organizes. And I think you're right that, like, in the organization of the plot, which moves in a kind of nonlinear fashion, um, there's a kind of mimicking of the kind of logistics of the heist, or the kind of logistical nature of the heist, the kind of very careful organization of multiple lines of action, which have to coincide and be kind of timed perfectly with each other, and so on. And then what's also striking, and I guess it's very Kubrickian in that sense, is that for him, that kind of machinery, and he's always been interested in the kind of machinery, not just as a kind of technological object, but as a kind of larger metaphysical question, or our world itself, our time being organized as some kind of infernal machine or something like that. Um, how it exceeds the capacities of the individual protagonist, basically, right? In some sense, he's interested in this gap between the kind of overall logistics of the heist as a kind of event, or as a kind of larger overall action, and the kind of small human concerns of the individual protagonists, and the way that these protagonists never attain or never become adequate to this kind of overall logistical nature of the heist as an event. And in that, of course, also again, chance or blind accident comes into play, right? Because it's such a kind of ironic or kind of humorous dimension to it, because it's again Sterling Hayden, of course, the protagonist
Yeah.
of the film. Again, the same actor who's at the center of the Asphalt Jungle. What ultimately thwarts him, or what thwarts them, basically, it's the luggage weight constraint. It's a kind of pure bureaucratic, impersonal sort of constraint, right? Which then produces the condition in which this suitcase full of money, which is being transferred to the plane, topples off of the vehicle because of a dog that has
Right.
escaped. So pure accident, pure
Yeah.
chance in some sense. So it's this, it gives you this image of these people, this group of people coming together, trying to engage in some kind of project in this world that's, on the one hand, a kind of pure logistical machinery, sort of pure necessity, and on the other hand, pure chance. And they kind of fall in between those two dimensions, sort of unable to be adequate to either of them. And there's, in a way, no tragedy. Just Sterling Hayden, Johnny Clay is the name of his character. At the end, what does he do? His Colleen Gray, who's his partner, says, "Let's run," and he says something like, "What's the point?" Basically. So there's
Right.
no even like existentialist pathos anymore.
Yeah.
Kubrick has sort of like stripped the heist plot of all of those sort of dimensions, in a way, and he's interested in the machinery of it, which is his kind of modernist auteur, I guess, take on the genre. Sort of, he strips it of the kind of humanist, existentialist dimension, and sort of presents you the heist as a kind of machine, basically, a machine that can go wrong by the introduction of chance contingency, but nevertheless a machine that is fundamentally inhuman in some way.
I would just add to that as well that
Yeah.
yeah, I mean that's really excellent, Luca. I agree with everything you just said. It's brilliant. I I also like as well certain notes being added. I'm calling heist films a continuum with crime film, and it's like an evolution that occurs quite rapidly now in the 50s as very self-conscious makers like Dassin casting himself, and executed in Rififi as as if he's sort of taking the rap for the whole subgenre. But notice as well what we get here as well of auteurs inserting references to games and game playing in these films. Flash forwarding to Pelham 123, Mr. Blue while in the cabin does a crossword puzzle.
Right.
Melville's Bob the Gambler has his little slot machine he plays every time. Here
Yeah,
as
right,
well,
right.
it's Kubrick, who was apparently obsessed with chess playing and the club where they play
Right,
chess and
right, right.
checkers. And it's, amplifying what Luca was just saying about the sort of infernal dynamic, right? You can see it, but you can't break it, right?
Yeah.
Of the heist film as a kind of, carefully engineered game, quite cerebral chess, crossword puzzles, or just, gambling per se. I'd also just add as well another one of the ghoulish sense of humor of these films creeping in. I do enjoy the bit where Johnny Clay whips out his mask for the actual robbery, and it's I'm told by my wife actually is the Red Skelton clown mask he slips on there,
Oh, is that what
which
it is?
makes adding to Luca's
Yeah.
point about the sort of infernal dynamic of this, the existentialist absurdism. It's sort of like bad vaudeville as well, isn't it? It's like a circus act,
Yeah.
right? Again, in which slapstick will unfold at the end with like, why is Kubrick showing us this little lapdog? Oh, that's why. And then we get, I would nod back again to Sierra Madre, that glorious shot of the suitcase and the banknotes billowing around.
Yeah,
No
right,
one
right, right.
chases after them, interestingly, at
They
the
just
airport. I would
blow,
think
yeah.
everyone would pile in, no, because it's just this sort of fountain of banknotes. And again, to Luca's point, now the logistics of weight, right? We have to be aware of the mechanics of the robbery. Money is heavy. How do we carry this? This will become another sort of dark joke in Widows later on, of just getting the money is one thing, and then it's getting it away somewhere else to safety. And this great, like, darkly comic denouement that I think is very, very Kubrickian.
Yeah. And going to the whole point, the nature of games and everything, and chess, which is a game that really is one of the few games that doesn't involve chance or luck. It's all about the skill. It's not like anything with cards or anything. And in the nature of luck, one of the gangsters here, or the members of the team, is thwarted by a horseshoe, which is the symbol of luck, right? Like that's his downfall when it punctures
Horses
his
again, just
tire.
like the Asphalt
Yeah,
Jungle, right?
yeah, right, right, right. Let's talk about Bob Le Flambeur, 1956, Jean-Pierre Melville. Again, another one we've chatted about quite a bit. In this French crime film, Bob, an aging gambler and ex-convict. I'm saying aging, but I mean, looked at this guy. I'm like, this guy is not aging. I'm older than this guy. And an ex-convict plans a daring casino heist in Deauville. As he assembles his crew and sets his plan in motion, Bob navigates the treacherous world of the Montmartre district in Paris, filled with rival criminals and his own personal demons. You talked a lot, like there's an interesting element to actually both the killing and this that involves the narrator, right? We have this sense of this omniscient presence that's kind of watching and telling us this tale it seems like it should already be something that they're going to get away with, because it's like this omniscient tale talking about how they're pulling all this off. Everything is so meticulous, yet there's always something that gets in their way. And here, as you've already pointed out earlier, Tim, we have the narration describing exactly how, like, this is how it should go, and we get to kind of watch the heist play out, only to then see that the whole thing ends up getting it gets pulled off. It gets thwarted by a number of things, but Bob gets himself distracted because, again, he's Bob the gambler, and he kind of steps back into that world, and he's making a ton of money. And it's like, would he have made that money? Like, he was losing, and so he put this plan into place, and now he's winning. It's like we were saying at the end of the Asphalt Jungle. Is just like, it was inevitable he was going to have to get to that horse field and then die. Like, that's the only way he'd be able to get there. And here it's like, would Bob ever have had another winning streak if he wasn't in the middle of this heist, right?
Right. Yeah, so many things. I love this film. I was quite obsessed with it when I watched it on BBC Two, I believe it was, late at night, and just, met Melville for the first time in this whole just universe. Well, I mean, first of all, it's such a beautiful film about location. Something that the heist films give us, whether it's, Las Vegas in Ocean's 11, a lot of films that are shot in and around New York City, or with so many of the French films, Paris is this perfect real world soundstage. This is a love letter to Montmartre. It's also interesting, this film, as a kind of precursor to the French New Wave, where Melville is often cited, although he typically in interviews said, there's no such thing as the French New Wave. I invented it in 1947, he said, with his first film, Silence of the Sea, which is a whole other conversation. But the film was shot with almost no money. Daniel Cauchy, who plays Bob's protege, Fathers and Sons again, said that basically they would get a phone call from Melville at 3:00 in the morning. Melville was a perpetual insomniac, and they would go out and shoot without permits. Very much a catch-as-catch-can style here of, before any authorities show up and say, you don't have a permit to film on the, the Sacré-Cœur, the area down below it there. And it's Melvillian to the core. There's the voiceover, the sort of predestination aspect of heist films, which essentially Melville raises the stakes here, whether it's jokes about, he tells us when, lights are about to go on in the city, but this, glorious, I have to say, and it's like Rififi, what can only be described as a hypothetical flash forward of all of the men at the Deauville casino standing there, I'm doing it on screen here, they're striking these poses of holding their guns out, standing at the top of stairs, Bob in his tuxedo, and then Melville abruptly says, but they've actually improved their system. We cut to something else instead. So it's just this sort of very, very playful, very self-conscious, the mode of production keeping costs low so you can control all aspects of it. This is now, for me, the heist film moving into the 60s. We should remember people like Louis Malle and Jean-Luc Godard watching Bob the Gambler, because it's cited in Breathless, that the French New Wave was in part underwritten with very playful, deconstructed crime films. And, Elevator to the Gallows is a great example of this, where Robert Bresson was assistant director. So, Melville's influence is really clear. His fingerprints and footprints are everywhere. But the film itself is just this, I think, very, playfully ironic, highlighting the sort of infernal machinery of the ending, I think, is rightly famous of this, of just the idea that, your best luck is at your worst luck moment. And circling back to Luca's point from earlier about the existential aspect of, I would say, quite a lot of heist films, and I would say almost all of the French entries, Sartre's notion is, what is the point of living? It's to be intentional every waking second. He says being alive is difficult. It's an ordeal. We must never, be lazy and be on autopilot. Well, in that climactic moment where Bob goes on his winning streak, or heist films elsewhere, it's this sort of incensed, in the moment, perfect being, which inevitably is unsustainable and crashes down. So in a sense, we get this, I think, with Bob, who's quite the existentialist protagonist, but with Melville's tongue firmly in his cheek, I think.
Yeah. It's also an interesting one, because this is where we're getting a different sort of relationship with the police that we hadn't had, where Bob and the police officer who ends up arresting him are friends. They're friendly. They, Bob had saved him at one point, and so there is this different sense of story that we have between those two. As at one point the cop is telling him, just don't do this. Just don't do whatever it is you're about to do.
But Bob cannot help but do it anyway, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And what's funny as well is that the inspector is played by Guy de Comble, who is famously the horrible school teacher in the infamous 400 Blows, bullying poor old Jean-Pierre Léa, which is Truffaut, like Godard, nodding back to this and saying, this is how you make auteurist cinema. you'll take popular materials like a genre, you'll put them in the blender, you'll fetishize or make abstract certain aspects, but above all, put your fingerprints all over it. I mean, I think Bob the Gambler is, Steven Soderbergh is clearly a descendant of this, of just the one who's most virtuoso is not just the thieves on screen, it's the director off screen. And there are constant references to that throughout the film. That, I think, is Melville's real intervention here.
Yeah. Luka, any thoughts on this one?
No, this was perfect. I would just add that I remember reading at some point that apparently Kubrick, after having watched Bob the Gambler, decided not to make any more crime films because he thought he could not do it better than Melville. So, but yeah, I find the film absolutely fascinating. It's such a, I don't know, it's such a free film in a way, and in many ways, I see it as in many ways more radical than anything that Godard or Truffaut did later on during the kind of French New Wave period. And the decision to replace the heist sequence with the gambling sequence, I think, it's just a fantastic choice to make. And I guess it also kind of breaks with the convention that you have to have a single heist sequence that the film focuses on. I mean, I guess it does, but it gets sort of allegorized, or it gets displaced into this kind of remarkable gambling sequence at the very end, and the heist, never takes place, or it's a very puzzling sort of choice or decision to make. It's like the end, it sort of confuses you in a way.
It's like, we're going to give you the heist, but we're really not going to give you the heist.
Or that point, we don't even need it anymore. You've all seen it so many times. You've seen Rififi, right? You know how this would. So we'll do this other riff instead.
Yeah, we're
just adding to Luka's point as well. One of just the pleasures of this film is, heist films teach us about the logistics of money, like hard currency. What I find hilarious about watching Bob the Gambler now is just, first of all, old francs, these enormous banknotes. I mean, they're like pillows you have to fold in half. And as Bob is winning at the end there, the chips at the casino table are absolutely enormous. They wheel them out in wheelbarrows at the end. And you get that again sort of joke within the joke of Bob saying, hey, the cops better not steal those winnings. I'm watching as they're putting him in the boot before we get that great exchange with him, as you're saying, Andy, his best friend, the inspector, of, maybe I'll go to jail, maybe I'll get parole. Well, with a good lawyer, I'll sue them for damages. So the whole thing is now just played for self-reflexive laughs. But I just love this idea about heists are about actual objects. They're diamonds, they're banknotes, or in this case, enormous like gold bullion or casino chips that you can't even carry anymore.
They're so big, right. So funny. We move from the 50s through the 60s. We're actually not talking about any films from the 60s, but there are some great ones. And the caper film kind of started emerging there with films like Ocean's 11, the 1960 version, and Top Copy. The Hays Code also comes to an end in the late 60s. And that pushes us into the 70s, when we start getting some grittier and more violent sorts of heist films, which, again, reflecting kind of the era. Films like Dog Day Afternoon or The Getaway, and blaxploitation starts getting into some of the kind of the heist films you see in films like Across 110th Street. And again, we kind of continue seeing an expansion of them in different cultures and around the world. And that takes us right back to Jean-Pierre Melville. We're going to talk about Le Cercle Rouge from 1970. In this French neo-noir heist film, a recently released thief, Corey, teams up with an escaped prisoner, Vogel, and a former police sharpshooter turned alcoholic, Jansen, to plan and execute a daring jewelry store heist. As the trio prepare for the heist, they are pursued by a relentless police commissioner who is determined to bring them to justice. Here we have, a return on the list of Melville a few years later, bringing a different feel to what he's going to be doing with his heist film. What is this one doing differently that we weren't just seeing when we were just talking about Bob Le Flambeur?
Shall I hop in on that one, Luka?
Sure.
I guess I'm part of Melville's gang, I aspire to be part of Melville's band here. I mean, first of all, to say that Melville's canvas has expanded by this point. He's now extremely commercially successful. In the 40s and 50s, he is like Kubrick. He was working very low budgets, very harried circumstances, a very on-off mode of production catches, sort of guerrilla filmmaking style, you'd call it. So by now, in the late 60s and early 70s, he dies young. This is his second last movie. He's working with some of France's leading stars and international stars. This is part of his trilogy with Alain Delon, along with Le Samurai, which is, again, I would put it in that bracket of one of the most influential movies of all time. And he's finding large audiences. More than 4 million people paid to see Le Cercle Rouge when it came out. So that's 1 in 10 French people, if we assume one visit, saw this movie, which is, astonishing. So it's, on the one hand, highly commercially viable. We should remember this for all the auteurist idiosyncrasy. It's commercially viable, perfect backdrop for people like Melville. So he's expanded his repertoire. He's got stars, he's got production design, large budgets, widescreen, color, but he's still working with Henri Decaille, his ace cinematographer who photographed about half of the French New Wave. And it's extremely stylized. Back to the Heist film with this, Alain Delon famously said when Melville first pitched him their first collaboration, Le Samurai, which everyone should see who watches this, just
brilliant
glorious.
film,
Apparently, Delon said when they met the first time, he read the script of Le Samurai and said, no one is saying anything. I'm the lead role, but flicking through the pages, 10 minutes has gone by at the start of this film. No dialogue at all. I'm in. So we've got this, laconic male archetype here again. Virtuosity rather than speech, right? Anyone can talk, but who can do?
Yeah.
This is one of Melville's equations here. And what we've got here, I think, is just a very pared down dynamic. He's sometimes described as minimalist, Melville. I would certainly call him stylized. His confrères are Robert Bresson and Jacques Tati, I would say, very stylized, instantly recognizable universes on screen. So this very epigrammatic idea, right? It's another Melville quote that he made up. Ravi Krishna, the people will return in the red circle and sort of fate will have its way, which Melville made up.
Yeah, such a funny element to
I know, of all things
fake
to
this whole
with.
thing. Yeah.
But he does the same thing with the Book of Bushido before the Samurai, and exactly the same. He made it up. Realism mattered to Melville not at all.
Yeah.
Genre dynamics, crime film, the policier, the heist film, pared down. That was everything. We get sort of similar tropes. The very long build up to the robbery where they're going over the rooftops. I would say that takes us back to, I mentioned Louis Fayard crime serials of the teens, which Melville, I think, enjoyed and rather fetishized. Silhouettes at night going over, chimney tops. Paris is famous for its rooftops. Beautifully, what a great backdrop for cat burglars. And I think it's, his web of citations, Houston, Louis Fayard, all of those things in there, boiled down to just these extraordinarily laconic set pieces in which, by now in Melville's universe and his contribution to the heist film internationally, archetypes, right? People who just have, like Inspector Mataille, played by the well-known, typically comedian, actually, Bourville. He was usually known just by his last name. One of my favorite, again, lugubrious jokes of Melville's films and heist films in general, the recurrent set piece, not of just the burglary, but of the inspector going home to feed his cats. Those are Melville's cats. Melville always puts his life in his films. Bob the Gambler's,
That's funny.
The enormous Cadillac he drives around, that's Melville's own car, tuned to Melville's favorite radio station, the American jazz you hear in Bob the Gambler. So it's these, little sort of played for laugh, vestigial, like, oh, the inspector has a life, right? Because he goes home and feeds Melville's cats.
Yeah.
Other than that, it's all work, isn't it? It's just this inexorable course, sharpshooter, ex-con, a thief, or, a fixer, and the inspector. And it's almost, personality doesn't matter. Dialogue is
good point.
pared away. It's all these sort of strange set pieces in, again, Montmartre, La Pégale as the neighborhood, Northwest Paris, sort of louche bars and bizarre stage shows. The women's costume changes, but the syncopation and the staging is almost the same.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very ritualistic now. I think this is Melville's main, the sort of new ingredient he adds to the brew here. The way he fetishizes action, but he also, it's very ritualistic. back to the joke of the inspector feeding Melville's cats, he does exactly the same thing. He walks the same way, light on in the same way, bowl down in the same way. And even the third cat who looks at the camera, as animals in cinema are apt to do, which I always find funny, it's exactly the same behavior patterns. So the point about preordained fatalism is down to sort of behavioral traits, doing exactly the same things. I'll just say one last thing as well. Another, just like the pleasures of these pleasurable commercial films that we love so much and go back to, and we get now on glorious Blu-ray reissues in 4K. The sharpshooter, the washed up Jansen, the sharpshooter, who comes for one last action, right?
Yeah, right.
Sort of quintessential heist moment, shooting the lock. I did research in Paris about this because you see on the lock there, the actual thing that's shot that gets them in.
Yeah.
It says JPM. And I was like, that's got to be right, Jean-Pierre Melville, JPM.
Oh,
but apparently it's actually a quite popular locksmith in Paris.
Oh, okay.
But I stick to my thesis. It's another sort of Melvillian footprint there, isn't it? Like the cats, like
That's
the
funny.
recurrent casting. So again, of just heist films pared down to these set pieces, microscopic flashpoints, very precise staged commercial traits that are kind of beautiful shorthand now. Everything is just like boiled down to its essence. With typically dialogue is almost redundant, right?
Yeah, it feels very Melville. Like we certainly see that in a number of his films.
Absolutely.
Would you mind if I just
yeah.
Sorry, Andy.
No,
Would you
go
mind
ahead.
if I asked just one question sort of for Tim, because I like this description of this kind of ritualism of the film. But then how do you make sense of this figure of Jansen, the character played by Yves Montand, right? I mean, who has the name of the great theologian from the 17th century, right? Who was the great
Right.
theologian of grace, right? I mean, the idea that salvation, basically free will, is nothing. Salvation only comes from these moments of grace, where God intervenes. And you have this character of Yves Montand, who is the sharpshooter, right? Who basically he engages in the kind of ritualistic performance of the heist. He sets up his gun on a tripod, and then just before shooting, he takes it off and aims sort of
Does it
freely.
himself. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a moment of
Freehand. Yeah.
it's a moment of pure grace in a certain way, right? Which also for a while at least basically gets him sober in a way. It cures him of this sort of alcoholism and his fears. He's able to look into the dark void through that door in his house again, and so on. And I think there's also maybe an idea of grace in this idea of the red circle, right? This place where these trajectories of these different men sort of cross for a brief moment, and they are able to act as a group. They're able to engage in a kind of adventure, and then they go separate ways, or they die, or something like that. So I guess this on the one hand, there's this kind of ritualization that Melville has gotten the genre down to its kind of basic machinery, but there's this dimension, naming a character Jansen, the kind of theological dimension of grace, of the moment in which something unexpected intervenes, which is where the salvation lies, which is not something you can will freely, but nevertheless it happens. It happens here and there without your control, and in some sense, part of the heist is making yourself available for that kind of moment as well.
Yeah, and it's, I mean,
perhaps.
absolutely to all of that, Luca. And grace is a great word. It's grace under pressure, isn't it? And it's
Yes.
this, one last glorious action. It makes me think of the ending of Le Samurai as well, where
Right.
Alain Delon again, Jeff Costello pulls on white gloves and goes to enact his tragic fate, is shot but has no bullets in his gun. And I would say, popular cycles giving a sort of philosophical subtext, but Melville is also quite playful and impish about this. Like at the end of The Samurai, the last thing we hear on the soundtrack, which is also very controlled and intentional, one of the cops goes "Badum-tsh" on the drum. So it's like a sort of like knowing joke almost about this as well. And it's both serious and playful, making these citations to genre, to philosophy, but also a little knowing humor about doing so as well, which I would fall back to Andy's point, very recognizably Melvillian, right? He's both serious and facetious, sometimes at the same time, which is, I think, very characteristic of French commercial cinema in general, and especially the heist film.
I I think that there's such an interesting element to all of that, and I hadn't really thought about the nature of grace through all of this, but it's actually an interesting point because again, it ties into the nature of building the team because you need all of these different people to do a certain thing and do it well and smoothly, and that's the nature of a perfect heist is everything is done with grace and style, and that's how you get away with it, right? And I think that's actually it's a pretty interesting way of looking at it.
And there's always this balance in these heist films. It's like in The Killing where you get the shots of people, there's like sweepers cleaning up, trash and detritus on the ground as the heist is coming together, as it's being executed with this very knowing voiceover. There's always this balance between chaos and mess and disorder and grime and perfection, fleeting, ephemeral. Again, going back to Luka's formulation, all the three of us coming together like good heist members, grace under pressure, right? It's like the beauty of the gesture. So all of these three men will end up, massacred in the filth, and we see them at the beginning of the film wallowing around in mud, as Alain Delon, comes together with Vogel,
Right.
From that, this beautiful moment. I think the crescendo is that bullet in the JPM, Jean-Pierre Melville, or otherwise lock. But it is this just like the beauty of the gesture, and in a sense, with heist films, that's all that matters. We know it's not it's not going to end well, but that moment of sort of fragile perfection, pulled off with beautifully choreographed style as well, right? It's about the filmmaker too. That's what this is all about.
Let's move to Joseph Sargent's 1974 film, The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3. In this tense thriller, a group of armed men led by the ruthless Mr. Blue hijack a New York City subway train and demand a ransom of $1 million. The film follows the efforts of Transit Authority Police Lieutenant Zachary Garber as he tries to negotiate with the hijackers and secure the safety of the passengers, all while navigating the complex politics and bureaucracy of the city. This is, I thought this would be an interesting one to include because it's an interesting spin on kind of like the heist story where it's like it's a hijack situation and they're going to use that as the opportunity to get the money and to create a situation where they can walk out of here with all the loot. We're also getting a situation here where it's for the first time in our conversations, we're getting them building a team. And sometimes you don't necessarily know all the people that you're building on the team, but this person supposedly does this job well. And it turns out they're a little violent and they're not doing things the way you want, and they maybe turn on you. And I can't help but feel like we're really stepping into the 70s at this point and getting a sense of kind of things that are grittier and more difficult. On top of all that, this is a flip to kind of like the main thief being our protagonist. Is the main thief our protagonist, or are we following Walter Matthau's character as the police lieutenant? A lot of interesting things changing here with what we're getting here. Luka, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, just to start with your last point, I mean, if in some way what's essential or what seems one of the kind of essential traits of the heist film is the fact that we identify as audience with the thieves, with the criminals.
Yeah.
And sort of enjoy and delight in their sort of adventure. It seems to me that the Pelham 1, 2, 3 doesn't provide for that in a way, right? I mean, we see a lot of them. We see a lot of their action. We follow them, but the way that they're presented, particularly the fact that we don't really have their origin story. We don't see them together as a team. And also certainly one of them is a kind of a very cruel sort of obscene, engages in kind of cruel, obscene violence.
Right.
Which is also counter heist, because often, typically a heist it doesn't involve guns, or there's a certain dimension of the heist that I think Tim was mentioning earlier, or the kind of virtuosity, which means also no use of physical violence in a certain way. And you will often have, like in Rififi, basically when they're planning, Jean Servais says to his team, no guns allowed, basically.
Right.
So there's a kind of special emphasis on that. Whereas here you have a group of thieves that sort of seems to relish the violence, at least some of them. And I think the kind of identification much more lies, like you mentioned, with the Walter Matthau character, the Lieutenant Zach Garber, right, who is the kind of in that sense the center of the film, with the mayor and the kind of whole political class of New York um, being presented as clowns, basically as useless sort of idiots in a way, right? So there's a tension between really the Matthau, the police, and the robbers, and in some sense we are made to identify with the police, which sort of to me stands out as like a distinctly perhaps anti-heist, or a kind of divergence from the more typical heist setup. And then the other is, of course, the hijacking itself in a way is not the stealing of an object. It's not engaging in action that ends up producing some kind of, object of um, special value in the end, but rather, in some sense, it's sort of capturing a place in order to kind of extract rent or something like that. So they're kind of
Yeah.
rentiers rather than producers. They're not artists in a certain way. You know what I mean? Which always makes me think that this film is a kind of perfect allegory of the kind of New York in the 1970s, as you know, like the city undergoing like severe financial fiscal crisis, where like, the President Ford basically tells New York City to drop dead, a famous news title or news line.
Yeah, headline, right.
So there's a headline. There's this way in which you have these remarkable images of a population captured by this, group of rentiers, basically, and there's those scenes of a train sort of going out, running wild without anybody in control. It's a kind of perfect image of the kind of like situation of the fiscal crisis of New York of the 1970s.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I see the thieves, if you read it in that kind of political allegory way, like you see the thieves more as the agents of that crisis rather than sort of the kind of more typical heist collective, which would go against a situation of dissolution or crisis in that sense. So to me, it's an interesting film to include in this list, precisely because it seems to diverge in these ways from the kind of typical heist sort of architecture that we've been discussing so far. But it's a remarkable piece of filmmaking. I mean, it's both. It has both kind of, it's thriller. It has both the intensity of action, the suspense, and also has this like constant humor that lies primarily with the Matthau character in some way, that sort of helps us get through it.
That makes me wonder, is there a subgenre of heist films that's more about like just the a robbery or a hostage situation? Like we end up getting the same thing in Dog Day Afternoon, which is a bank heist. They're going in there to take all the money, and it turns into this elaborate long day-long thing, kind of battle between the criminals and the police. And we have something similar here as they're trying to kind of like put a plan into place so that they can make it out of here. And everybody's like, why would they be in the subway? Like, there's no way out. They're completely trapped. And that's part of part of the puzzle that as an audience, we're like, okay, well, this is the fun part, because we also are, actively trying to figure out how are they going to get out of here and see if we can figure it out before they do. Luca, I know you're a little tight on time. Are you needing to get out of here? I believe we might have lost him for a sec.
No, I'm here. Yeah.
Okay.
I think I'd say the difference with something like the Dog Day Afternoon would be that in the Lumet film, right, you have a sympathetic protagonist, like the Pacino character who sort of tries to rob the bank in some sense, is someone you can identify with. He's a kind of outsider. He is not he's not a professional, right? In the case of the Pelham, there's a sense of they're mercenaries in a certain way, right? Which provides for a very different sense of what the nature of this sort of criminal act is in a certain way. Whereas in the case of Dog Day Afternoon, you have the kind of sympathetic working class protagonist who, out of an act of desperation and to help his friend basically go through an operation, decides to rob the bank. And
Yeah.
I think that falls more in line with this kind of, what in the heist genre would be the kind of small time crook variation of the heist genre.
Just a footnote that no, Luca is that's beautiful description what he's given us there. Just as a little footnote to this, Andy, this actually circles back to something you were talking about earlier on about censorship and the heist film. Returning to Pelham as I did before this, I was reminded of some of the discourse about this film when it came out and forever after of great concern by the New York Transit authorities, allowing them to film there, although apparently there was no graffiti was allowed to be shown on screen because obviously no rats, no graffiti in the New York subway system, obviously none of that. But there was great concern about this film with its showcasing how basically you can, pull off some kind of hijacking down there with the train cars, like the logistics of crime, which is interesting because it takes us all the way back to Rififi and others. I mean, this was always one of the censorship concerns, even in France, where censorship was more relaxed comparatively. But I've heard that Rififi was cut as it traveled around the planet. I think it did poorly in England, in Mexico, certain territories, because of this exact issue, right? Of this is apparently the censors worry, as censors do, that it's a pedagogical text, right? It's teaching you how to pull these terrible things off. Although frankly, it would defy anyone to pull off what Tony and gang do in Rififi. If you can do that, then, you're welcome to your diamonds. But the same thing with this. I'd also just nod real quick as well at, again, the influence of Melville, of the way Mattau's sort of quiet, quotidian, people-centered heroism, as he clearly is, the sort of seeker protagonist hero of this film latterly, of the way in which it maps out your point again, Andy, of modern technology, of the lights and the computer, proto-computer system of the subway, where the train is, where it's accelerating, where the stops are, which is very reminiscent again of Le Samurai and the sort of famous, brilliant set piece of the cops chasing Alain Delon's samurai anti-hero through the metro in Paris. It's very similar, of lights on a board, an inspector coordinating, various embassies running hither and thither, always getting it wrong, and then finally them figuring out, where he is, the system sort of prevailing. So anyway, again, it's like heist films, technology, tracking, surveillance, and the literal and figural underworld, right? The subway in New York, or the metro for Melville in The Samurai.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating one, and it's an interesting exploration of like how heist is it? Is it heist? Is it just a crime thriller? But I think it's certainly an interesting one to discuss here. We're not going to, or let's move into the 80s. We start seeing some more neo-noir heists, and we're going to kick things off with Michael Mann's 1981 film Thief. In this film, Frank, a professional safecracker, takes on one last job, one last score before I'm going to retire, before he attempts to leave the criminal world and start a new life with his girlfriend, Jessie. However, he finds himself caught between his criminal associates, a corrupt cop, and a ruthless mobster who wants to exploit his skills for his own gain. This, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, like Michael Mann is notorious as one of these people who's like, I want to show it like it really is. We see this here. We see this in Heat, where he hires real criminals to teach the actors, to say like, this is how we do it. And we get a fascinating heist sequence at the center of this, which I really enjoy watching, with kind of like that giant metal rod burning on one end that they're using to kind of melt their way into the safe, which I think is fantastic. Also something that we've started seeing through some of this, but we're also getting kind of, we have the main heist, but we have like the preliminary heist. We come in the middle of like this heist that they're doing, and we're using that as a sense to get a handle on what these people do, right? We can see, okay, this is what Frank's job is. This is what his buddy's job is. And we're getting a sense of how it all plays, like how it's meant to go when things go right, so that we can see how it actually goes when it goes wrong. This is also, we're getting some darker characters here with kind of the nature of Frank, and certainly the way that he sees the world and everything, much more dark and cynical, that he's kind of like taken on from his time in prison, and certainly spells spells things out for where he takes things at the end of the film, where it's just going to like burn it all down, basically. This is a fascinating film. It's very realistic and gritty. Where does this sit for the two of you in the scope of this subgenre?
A couple. I mean, I can jump in and then we can back and forth, Luca. I mean, one thing I would just say as a kind of sub-headline of this whole conversation, I was struck returning to these films and Thief especially, of looking backwards, film historians, cinephiles as we are, looking at these films, and I would say Rififi in the 50s, Le Cercle Rouge, now this film, they're sort of quintessentially of their time. I think if you were to sit someone down and say, show me a film that sums up the early 80s aesthetic, I mean, Thief is pretty much, it covers some ground for us, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I would say this film is to the heist film what Blade Runner is to the science fiction film, similar kind of period. Vangelis, the score for Blade Runner, Tangerine Dream for this film. First of all, as I'm contractually obligated to do, Michael Mann is another huge Melville disciple. I'd say that, gloriously 80s opening montage, no words again. I think it's about 10 minutes. So it is very much like The Samurai. What Alain Delon loved about that, James Caan clearly loves here, of if you are to show a heist film in sort of literal and figurative pyrotechnics, right? The shot you were summoning for us, Andy, later on, the heist, but that beginning shot, Mann loves very long lenses, so we've lost depth cues, something we see in Pelham as well, that very 70s, early 80s aesthetic of sort of restless zoom lenses, zooming in, very, highlighting details, very shallow focus. So when it's, I mean, excuse my, I'm going to sound a little psychoanalytic here of, these incredibly long drill bits, penetrating steel, and these like glorious explosions of sparks.
Yeah.
I mean, never has an oxyacetylene torch been as glorious on screen as in Thief, thanks to Michael Mann's style here. I'd also say, beyond style, what I find fascinating about this film, and I remember when I first saw it, I read interviews with James Caan, who had, obviously played a lot of ne'er-do-wells and gangsters and so forth. But he said he really struggled with his character because he felt like there was just no emotionality to him at all. And he said, as a performer, I struggled to find ways that the audience would engage with him. But for me, looking back, this is one of the things that makes this film really interesting. I was talking about heist films and, capitalism, of people, desperate for wealth, one gesture to attain it, and it's lost. Here, James Caan's whole psychology, he's been in jail for his formative years, right? He spends his whole 20s inside, comes out, his relationship with the Tuesday Weld character, they're both of them incredibly emotionally stunted. And one of the most extraordinary sequences of this film, where part of the negotiation of you're part of the criminal underworld is James Caan essentially buying a child. And it's as if the whole of like the things we human beings want, a partner, a family, a stable, secure life, is everything is, to be bought and paid for with criminal prowess. So those pyrotechnic moments and, the fetishistic, never has a drill bit turning seems so kind of graphically compelling to us on screen, right? It's like Eisensteinian. But the whole remit of the film is these are people who are asocial. They're not socialized in any conventional way. There's no courtship. There's no sort of home life. It's a weird kind of corkscrew of a Melville protagonist, I guess, like Alain Delon, of just, or the inspector with his, all he does is feed 3 cats. The whole thing is just a sort of financial contract. Everything in, the world we see on screen is dollars and cents, and the ability to procure those through stealing things. It's kind of a remarkable early 80s film, I think. Everyone thinks about, Wall Street and all of the Stone movies and those kind of things. But in his own way, Michael Mann is quite caustic. He's quite austere about how America works.
True.
Yeah,
Luca?
I would fully agree with that. I mean, to me, it's one of the best movies about the Reagan era, I think, in this country. I guess one can see it as a kind of transitional film between the kind of new Hollywood cinema of the 70s and the kind of emerging neoclassical cinema. And sort of one big theme that's part of the film that, just to connect to something that Tim was talking about earlier, this is the question of fatherhood or the figure of the father or the father-son relationship that sort of seems important for the heist film as a genre. I mean, here it's really everywhere, right? I mean, um, James Caan character has two fathers, right? One is Willie Nelson, the imprisoned
Right.
sort of who was I guess his sort of mentor. And then the incredible Robert Prosky, who appears as Leo, the sort of, you know, uh, um, just kind of almost a kind of corporate crime mastermind or something like that,
Yeah, right.
who sort of becomes this kind of obscene, violent father figure that sort of basically strips him of any kind of illusion in the end of his own freedom in a certain way. And then there's his own attempt to become a father, which, as Tim was talking about, occurs through him having to purchase, or his second father, the Leo character, making it possible for him and Jesse to purchase a child because they can't do it through regular kind of adoption channels, right?
Right, yeah.
So
Okay.
they can't adopt a child through regular channels. I mean, there's a remarkable scene in the adoption agency where James Caan's character doesn't know how to spell male, right? He spells it MAIL, right? As he's
Yeah.
told by the bureaucrat there. So there's this whole kind of crisis of masculinity that the film is tackling, which is in many ways, I think, countered by man's sort of fascination with professionalism. And this kind of, it's not so much artistry as professionalism. That's distinct, I think, from earlier heist films where there's a kind of virtuosity that's almost artistic or aesthetic. In Man, there's a kind of fascination with the professionalism of the thieves, and the kind of professional activity, professional collective activity, as the moment in which some kind of respite from the otherwise brutal world can be obtained. But one thing that I always find sort of curious about this film is the way that the James Caan characters, the protagonist, so Frank, sort of condenses two different things. On the one hand, he's a small business owner, which
Right,
means he
yeah.
employs people. He has workers working for him. He seems to be well off, or at least, the business seems to be doing well. There's no indication it's not, at least in the film. And at the same time, he's meant to identify as a worker, basically, right? And the complaint he makes against the Robert Prosky character, Leo, is, that he is taking the fruit of his own labor, basically, which is not the complaint of a small business owner, right? Small business owners are meant to take the fruit of the labor of their employees, right? It's rather the complaint of the kind of more typical working class figure. And I always
Hmm.
found it sort of very sort of strange the way the protagonist in this film, the kind of key main character, sort of is meant to condense uh, these two dimensions. On the one hand, he sort of still refers back to the kind of working class, even the kind of industrial working class, right? That scene of the robbery evokes the kind of factory, or even the kind of smelt, the kind of
Yeah.
even kind of very primordial sort of industrial factory imagery of metal melting and so on. There's a kind of nostalgia for the factory in the kind of already deindustrializing Reagan years that you get inscribed there. And on the other hand, there's him as a small business owner, which is, what increasingly in the 80s and later on, more and more Americans, even working class Americans, are meant to identify as, basically. So it's also
Yeah,
an
right.
interesting kind of transitional film in that regard, that on the one hand, it has its foot as a kind of heist film, as a film about labor, professionalism in the kind of older industrial period, and a kind of older industrial figure of a worker and labor. And it already sort of, as Tim was saying, points to the aesthetic of the 80s, but also kind of political ideology of the 80s, where the kind of typical position in society for a person is not that of a worker or employee, but rather a small business owner, an entrepreneur of one's
Yeah.
own self, and so on and so on. So it's a kind of a really striking thing, it always seemed to me in this film, that it condenses these two different moments in a single figure, which I don't think it's coherent. But precisely because he turns him into such a surface, into such a kind of de-psychologized, emotionally stunted figure, I think he's able to use him to inscribe this tension or this transition between these two different understanding of what one is as a working member of society in this particular moment of the beginning of the Reagan years in some way.
I think that's exactly right, Luca. And is he as much a character? He's just a sort of an agent. He just does things, beautifully, fluently, unstoppably. But when it comes to words like you're citing the adoption scene, as soon as he has to talk or write or spell or function socially, he just loses his temper and becomes enraged. I'd also just say ending this analysis on the ending. We do, heist films give us wonderful things. They give us very iconic moments. They're quite modish. They're quite of their time, but they do give us these wonderfully iconic moments. And I would just like to flag the ending of Thief. It's like Bob the Gambler. It's this great absurdist ending, isn't it? Bob wins, but he loses. He's got more money than he knows what to do with, but maybe he'll go to jail, or maybe he'll sue and get out and and live the life he's always wanted. So here with Thief, this great shot of these incandescent executions. We think he's murdered, but no, he's got the bulletproof vest on. And then that crane shot of him walking off down this really quintessentially American suburbia, street,
right?
Tree-lined. What does he do now? Where does he go? What kind of life can he possibly lead? How invested man is in thinking about those questions, I don't know, but it's this wonderfully absurdist heist denouement, isn't it? You get away, but what have you gotten away with? You're wealthy and free, but what do where do you live? How do you function now? What do you do with the rest of your life? Because he's literally destroyed his own life, burning his own business down, and jettisoning his wife and his child. It's kind of extraordinarily bleak but beautiful at the same time, which I would say is that's the heist film lexicon, isn't it?
Well, and we definitely see that.
Oh, sorry.
We definitely see that with Man, and I think that's such an interesting element of these crime films, because we can certainly say a lot of the same things about Robert De Niro in Heat. This is a person who wants to function as in the real world, like in the suburbia. He wants to be kind of that sort of life, but in some way it still is like play acting, because what he really is just the professional, and he needs to just stick with what he's good at. And as you two were both talking about, he has to buy his way into having a family. The great conversation that he has with Jesse at the diner about, like, this is what I do, and pulling her into that kind of brutal cold world that he lives in. And it's just this sense that it's almost a facade that he's creating, because that's what he's supposed to do, right? He's supposed to have these businesses, the Reagan era, like, start up your own little businesses and be your own boss and all this sort of thing. But in the end, he can't, and he has to let it all go. And I mean, he doesn't let it all go. He forcefully pushes it away. He tells Jesse, get the hell out, take the kid and get out. Like, that's what it is to him. It's like he's going back to the cold realities of what he actually is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I would just say the one thing about the final sequence, which is that I think it's actually possible to read it as a kind of sequence separate from the rest of the film, or the action of the film, as a kind of pure fantasy sequence, or kind of pure revenge fantasy sequence, in a way. And and you can think about how this trope of revenge will become important for the movies of the 80s, precisely of the period, like Rambo or something like that. It's in some sense not even real action anymore, but it's a kind of pure fantasy of revenge out of position of complete impotence, in some sense, that man gives us at that point in the film. Because it's true, like, where does one go afterwards? I mean, it's, in a way, it kind of stands on its own, in a way.
Yeah. It's a fascinating example of kind of like how we've been evolving these heist films when we get to this place to see what Michael Mann does with this story. Um, Through the 90s and 2000s, we started getting more of the lighthearted heists and more technology, more complex plot structures, more international heist films. We really started seeing kind of an expansion. And that takes us to 2001, Steven Soderbergh's Ocean's 11, which this is a good example of the heist film, or maybe the caper film. It kind of fits there. Although it's definitely a heist, but I mean it is so lighthearted, it's so easygoing and just something that you can just kind of like let flow over you. And I think that's what's so fun about it. And here again, we have building the team, the whole getting the team of 11 that is part of the title, and in a way, really kind of reinvented the heist for a new generation. Like we had classic elements. It's very jazzy. It feels. I mean, it's a remake of a 1960 film, but we're getting a very modern, very stylized approach, and um, with a fantastic heist at the center of it. How does this one play for the two of you? Do you find that this one, does it lean more heist? Does it lean more caper? Where does it sit for you?
I guess I always think of these films, as I said earlier, Andy. I think of them, it's a continuum of elements. I'm not sure there's any
Yeah,
hard and fast point of like,
I
that's a
know.
heist, like there it is. So, I agree with you, but I would even say, this is true of a lot of films of the 50s, especially, my beloved French 1950s policiers. They often have these rather fluid aspects to them. Sometimes they're played for laughs, sometimes they're quite brutish and nasty. And this is, I think, a backdrop of a lot of the films that we've been talking about so far. I think it's interesting. Luka was talking about commercialism, and you could even say what Ocean's 11's contribution, if you want to call it that, to the heist cycle is. These films, I think, were always going back to The Killing, for example. They're often in ensemble pieces, but they were typically character actors, and sometimes quite not very well-known performers made their greatest contribution, and films people still watch today in cinema in these kinds of movies. But what we've got here is, I mean, right down to the sort of stunt joke credit at the end of and introducing Julia Roberts. What Soderbergh is doing here, I mean, obviously via the remake, by the original, is, well, why not have that ensemble cast, the plotting of the heist, but almost everybody is a star or a celebrity. So you could say, like, adding to the commercial pool here, instead of having, that lesser known character actor from some television show of 1952, everybody is iconic. You could say, sort of stacking the brew. Looking back on it again, I mean, it's staggering to me. It's already 24 years old, this film, but
Yeah.
it's very, I mean, it's clearly a descendant of Michael Mann. And I know Soderbergh is another fan of Jean-Pierre Melville, of a very hyper stylized film. I think its use of heist film plotting it's very epigrammatic. Again, everything is a sort of playful set piece moment. There's very little expositional uh material to it. We don't get the sort of build up to the heist, fallout from the heist. Almost all of it is little, ingenious denouements or set pieces involving acrobatics or, badinage or banter among stars. And you could say the change that's happening here in the commercial context is the stars are the commodities now, their bodies, their, repertoire. It's all a kind of shorthand, I think, on screen as well. It's also interesting getting to our final three films in the 21st century now. What I was thinking about watching them again was what we're getting here is, I think, increasingly, I mean, obviously we saw this with Pelham and some others, but a kind of systematic way in which the institutions that are being robbed, whether it's a bank or a casino, are embodied in very negative ways,
Hmm.
as in the group of criminals are heroicized because they're taking on something explicitly corrupt. I
Sure.
think it's part of the skill of Andy Garcia's performance. The only performer really on screen who's unsympathetic, the only one who's sort of venal and corrupt and narcissistic. Everybody else is, communal and playful and
Yeah.
shot to match by Soderbergh as his own DP, as always.
Which will
So,
change a little
like,
bit by the time we get to Ocean's 13. But yeah.
there we go. But, it's interesting how, Las Vegas is made to seem, justifiably there for the taking for them, I suppose.
Sure. Yeah. Luca?
Yeah, this is fantastic. I mean, I think one thing that I would just maybe note is the kind of Soderberghian trickery in this film. If you sort of watch it carefully, I mean, you notice that he moves between the planning of the heist to the execution of the heist and back in the seamless type of way. Um, but if you watch it carefully, it logically doesn't make sense, right? There's a you can focus, for instance, when you watch this film on the Malloy brothers, the two brothers from Utah who are the drivers.
Yeah.
How during the heist they appear in all these different places, dressed in different uniforms, that make the heist sort of flow as this kind of frictionless, seamless operation. But if you really think about it, it would be physically impossible for them to do. So there's this way in which Soderbergh is organizing. I think Andy, you use this term. I think it flies over you or something like, or flows over you or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly right. It's like the heist is this sort of pure effect, pure surface effect. That is very impressive. It's almost a kind of abstract idea of the heist that he gives you, that if you sort of really try to reconstruct it in terms of its sort of spatial or temporal logic, it doesn't actually work. It's not consistent in a way, and I find that quite interesting as an idea for a heist film. So there's this sort of interesting thing that he's, I think, unique. I don't know if I mean, sure, other films sort of cover over certain inconsistencies, but here it's kind of systematic almost. That he kind of he's interested in the kind of aesthetic effect of heist as an action, as a set piece, as a kind of complex operation, and he achieves it at the level of his aesthetic form that transitions the editing that he organizes. Um, but not necessarily at the level of kind of concrete plotting out, if that makes sense. And I think that's quite striking. And I think it's also what allows him to kind of refer back to Heist, the 1960s caper, the Las Vegas film, et cetera, et cetera.
And very specific stylistic citational stuff as well, Luca, just to double down on what you're saying. I mean, I was talking about Melville, late 60s, early 70s, and Pelham, like the restless zoom aesthetic he does. I mean, he's very so. This is another thing to say maybe about heist films in general. They're very citational. They're very referential. And the repertoire is like a sort of shared palette. You go backwards. And what Soderbergh is doing to aestheticize is to cite early American and French films from the late 60s and 70s, and to do that with zoom lenses and, the musical soundtrack. But I agree with you about, the pure aesthetics. I mean, it's the payoff of the color lit fountains
Yes,
on the main
it's a
strip of
beautiful
Vegas
shot.
there as well,
Yeah,
isn't it? Which
yeah,
made me think, of course, of the heist in Thief with Mann's
yeah,
very long lens, that extraordinary shot, the setup of James Caan sitting down, sort of basking in the glow of the successful penetration of the safe with the longest, and like there's just the fountain of spark. It's almost like James Caan's body's on fire. He's a long way away, but the zoom lens compresses him in. Soderbergh is doing the same thing. It's just a sort of pyrotechnical cinema. Yeah, they
And
don't care
featuring
about plotting. There's no worries like Pelham and Rififi of like, you could learn how to do a robbery from watching this film. Scream the
yeah,
sense.
good luck.
You're not going to learn how to rip off Andy Garcia from this movie.
If you could find a giant electromagnetic device that can wipe the power out of the entire city, yeah,
It's always
maybe.
handy.
Yeah,
Always handy
right.
to have one of those in your garage.
Yeah, right. I
and
was just gonna.
he does make it visible, like before the very last sequence, where Julia Roberts and Brad Pitt go to pick up Clooney from jail, right? That sequence is introduced with the intertitle that says 3 or 6 months later,
You're
right?
right.
So he kind of like drops all of these signs that the kind of precision of plotting, the kind of kind of purely logical construction of the sequence of events is not necessarily what he's after, right? He's
Yeah, which
after a certain different kind of aesthetic effect of the heist, which I think he achieves quite successfully.
Yeah. And
plays
the same,
opposite what we get in like The Killing, right? Which is very at 4:56
Yes.
p.m., right?
psychologically grounded as well, right? Like, what do we
Yeah.
know about Brad Pitt's character? He eats in every scene. And like,
Yeah.
that's it. We're done with dramaturgy. Let's get back to those zoom lenses now, right?
Yeah. I just also love pointing out that Scott Kahn is one of the Malloy brothers, which I'm sure that Soderbergh was thinking about Thief when he wanted to cast James Caan's son to play him in that
That's
role.
a great
So,
father-son
yeah.
relations in heist films.
Yeah, right.
But the family tree of cinema, I mean, this is the other thing, is that all of these filmmakers have seen all of the other filmmakers. You know, I think of
Yeah.
film history in general as a conversation. This is probably one of the most convivial, you know, passing the baton on from one generation to another types of cinemas, you know, crossing national boundaries that there is. I mean, the heist film is just, again, it's citational, it's, you know, associational, it's casting, it's repetition of plot points, and just like collectively raising the stakes as we go. So by, I think, our more contemporary films, you know, you could argue maybe the pudding is oversweetened at this point, but you could also say that that makes it all the more enjoyable to watch sometimes.
Well, I think just the nature of it being a remake in and of itself, it points to all of that, right? I mean, it's in the fact that it's already referential, because it's like, we're going to actually take this and remake it. So let's jump forward a few years, 5 years, to Spike Lee's Inside Man. In this clever and suspenseful heist film, a mysterious man named Dalton Russell orchestrates a complex bank robbery in Manhattan. As the heist unfolds, a tense hostage situation develops, and a dedicated police detective, Keith Frazier, is assigned to negotiate with the criminals. The film explores the intricate web of relationships between the robbers, the hostages, and the authorities, all while gradually revealing the true nature of the heist and its ulterior motives. We're getting to a point where we're starting to see some social commentary and different ways of thinking as it comes to the heist films. It's not just about, we're going to make off with all this loot. Now we're getting to a point where they're starting to think about, why are we going to make off with all of this loot? What are we actually trying to point out with this? And I think that's an interesting element that we have here, certainly with Spike Lee at the helm. I think that there's a lot more opportunity for some moral ambiguity, hidden agendas, just a different type of story that we're going to be getting now. Again, with fantastic set piece or your surprises for the audience. The fact that, and again, we're spoiling all of these for people who haven't seen these, the fact that their whole plan is to actually build a fake wall in which the criminal is hiding for weeks on end before he finally just casually walks out. I think that's a brilliant way to kind of play the heist. This is an interesting one. There's a reason behind our heist. That's a little more. How does that work for the two of you?
It's funny in a way of just the contemporary distillation of heist tropes. And you could say what we're ending up here is a film in which the entire heist itself is a kind of bait and switch or sleight of hand, right?
Yeah.
Did it actually occur at all? Well, the authorities, it turns out, want the whole thing hushed up. Everything we've seen on screen, including apparently a hostage being executed, is all for show, is all fake. So on the one hand, you know, it's a little like Ocean's 11, things from the past intensified or heated up, almost to the point of, per Luca's point, you know, ridiculousness of plotting. I do dispute the shape Clive Owen would have been in emerging from that fake wall behind there. Like, I just don't see that happening.
You don't think it looks bad
That's
enough?
not what this film is about. It's not about practical. Again, you know, to be fair, this would take us back to Melville of just, you know, I'm not really interested in realism. These are not films that are naturalistic for the most part, right? It's also interesting as well. We get midway through, I'm going to go back to Bob the Gambler. We get the hypothetical flash forwards briefly, which I found interesting, of when they are thinking through of like, what are the different ways they can go in, you know, go descend into the bank and free the hostages. Well, that's not going to work, right? That one's going to end badly. We get the same shot in one of those little miniature what if set pieces of the robbers being shot and the eruption of banknotes again. So we're back to all the way back to the killing and this sort of Pyrrhic denouement again there. But I think it's another one in which we see, I remember when the film came out, Clive Owen was very concerned in one interview he gave where he said he was almost reluctant to take the part on because so much of it, he's got that very constrictive mask on and glasses. So again, it's like the thieves in Pelham 1, 2, 3. They all look exactly the same. They've all become sort of just people, just agents who are doing things. So for him as a performer, that's a challenge that apparently gave him pause. But it's again heist films as being about pure corporeal action, right? It's not about personality. It's not about tics or traits. It's just about set pieces, and it's about perfect syncopation of the team, all of them working together. And the idea, I guess, ultimately is the joke sort of on us as a viewer. We've been fooled. But the same thing again of just, heist films in a kind of quite, I think, maybe superficial way of just what this film is actually about is about, the greed of banks, and it's about, generational crimes and atrocities from the Second World War. So that this is a film that wants to use the heist to get to that ultimately, you think?
Yeah. Luca?
Another thing that this film, I think, teaches us nicely is sort of what is the object of the heist, right? Because in this illustrates it perfectly, I think, because in this film you have these jewels, if I remember correctly, right, which were basically stolen by the Christopher Plummer character from Jewish families who perished in the Holocaust, and he basically steals that wealth, brings it over, and uses it to found a bank, right?
Yeah.
And he stores these jewels in the bank, but in a safe box, but without that box being accounted for in the bank's own accounts, right? So
Yeah.
you have, in some sense, this strange object, just that's nothing. It doesn't exist for the bank. The bank doesn't know about it, and yet it's everything because it's foundational for the bank. Without it, the bank could not have been founded in some sense. And it's that sort of combination of nothing and everything, or how one object can be nothing and everything, that makes it exceptional, makes it different from any other object in the bank. And the robbers aren't after the money, they aren't after anything else, right? They're after this kind of particular type of object that I think if you look back on other heist films we talked about or the ones we haven't talked about, there's always something like that to the object of the heist. The very fact that an object becomes invested by the group that's trying to steal it turns it into this kind of object that in some sense is more than any other objects, and also can quickly turn to nothing. For instance, that scene that Tim has multiple times sort of evoked of of money suddenly being scattered in the wind, which is money, valuable object turning into pure paper, basically nothingness, certainly. And there's something about the inside man that really exemplifies this kind of curious status of the object that the heist typically revolves around, or that sustains the desire of the heist in some way. And that because it has to be exceptional in a way, and it's in its exceptionality also typically means that it can't that easily be sort of circulated, sort of turned into just a regular object of exchange, even after the heist might have been successful. And here, Andy, as you were putting it, put it basically, Spike Lee uses this object and turns it into a kind of tool of critique, right? Because it points to the way that the institution itself can't recognize, can't account for the very thing that made it possible, basically. And bringing this object up to the surface, in a way, dismantles it in some sense, right? And ultimately ends in the kind of solidarity between the cop, Denzel Washington, and Clive Owen, even, right? There's a real transgression of the typical lines between crime and order, law and crime, that happens in the end of the film, precisely because of the excavation of this exceptional object, which the bank can't know about, precisely because it's everything for the bank, because it made the bank itself possible in a certain way. I think there's some kind of general logic of the kind of object at the center of the heist that you can discern from that. Of course, it goes through different variations. It's not as clear in all the films, but there's something like that at work in the jewels, the money, the gold, whatever the painting, whatever the heists are about. In some sense, those objects are vehicles to make this logic of nothingness and everything that makes for exceptionality visible, or something that action can get oriented around.
That's really interesting, Luca. And what's also we get another one of these, absurdist heist film endings, don't we? Like Bob the Gambler, like Thief, of maybe, I suppose, projecting forward, the great unraveling of the heist is going to unravel Christopher Plummer, and his whole empire, right? Like, is this going to undo the bank? It's also interesting to think back to Rififi and the line you get scribbled in the deposit box, follow the ring, right? It's all about the ring, that fetishistic heist totem. That's Cesar's undoing, stealing the ring that will identify everything in Rififi. Here, it's like that's what's going to bring down everything else. And as a little PS, the diamond that Denzel Washington gets, that's going to become maybe an engagement ring to maybe get his whole, unruly personal life in order as well. So you get a kind of doubling up of the heist film bait and switch finale there. But as to whether that bank is really going to come down, I must admit a little skepticism, and I think Spike Lee would probably be skeptical too.
Yeah, right. Maybe Christopher Plummer's character, but the bank might live on. Yeah. It's a fantastic film. Let's move on to our final film, though. This is moving forward in time to the 2010s and the 2020s. We really start kind of subverting expectations and expanding representation, certainly with these. More diverse casts, more, again, kind of continuing what we were just talking about, more socially conscious themes with films like Widows, Ocean's 8, The Misfits. We're going to talk about Widows, which really subverts the traditional heist by, again, we have a female-led cast here who aren't actually the thieves, right? They are the wives of the thieves who all get killed. And now these women set out to actually pull off the job. Let me just read this. So this is Steve McQueen's from 2018. A group of women, all widows of a criminal crew killed during a botched robbery, team up to complete the heist their husbands had planned. As they navigate the challenges of the criminal underworld, corrupt politicians, and their own personal struggles, the women forge a bond and discover their own strength and resilience in the face of adversity. I find this to be such a fascinating example. It's a heist film that's in many ways less about the actual heist, the physical moment where they're actually committing it, and more about them trying to figure out how to do this. Can we do this? And like, it's really, that's what the film is about them getting comfortable with the idea of actually being able to pull this off.
Although ironically, what's interesting is it's actually a heist film that has two heists in it, right? We have the one at the beginning with those characteristically for me, Steve McQueen is hailed for many things. He's also a brilliant editor, I think, of those shots of domestic intimacy, Viola Davis in bed with Liam Neeson kissing, and we're cutting to,
to the crime,
doors flying off the van and explosions and people running at them and the camera shooting at them. That heist going wrong, and then obviously the one we get to later on. It's a really, interesting inversion now, and it does seem like this is another sub-cycle of whatever we're up to now, Andy, a sub of a sub of a sub.
Right. How deep can we go?
Women-centered heist films, going back to Ocean's 8 and that whole inversion of that by then franchise, right? And it's interesting how the film recasts women in this guise. If I can get in a quick plug, I co-edit a journal with my superb partner, Liza Palmer, called Film Matters. And we have an article coming out at the end of this year in our 16.3 issue by John Alexander Mansilla called Robbing the Patriarchy. And he's talking about this film and others like it. So it's, this is clearly a cultural moment. Just to cite that piece. But it's interesting for me watching this film. There's a wonderful shot to cite that shot. I love watching Steve McQueen films for many reasons, one of which is how brilliant he shoots faces. He has a very sculptural aesthetic. He's very, even more intentional than people like Mann and Soderbergh of just bringing out pores and sweat forming through sweat glands and people who are under duress but trying to set their face, keep their game face on, as it were, just in his body of work, like Blitz, which is fantastic. There's a great shot where early on in the film, after Viola Davis has been apparently has lost her husband, Liam Neeson, and it's just I think it's a medium close up on her, and she's sobbing and just in complete physical disarray, just racked with emotion, tears, completely, freeform facially. And McQueen just holds on that shot, and then she sets herself back again and course corrects and gets things back in order and won't show any emotion really again until the final shot when she smiles for the first time to Elizabeth Debicki at the end. And for me, it was like, oh, this is really interesting, because what heist films are about is as we've talked about a lot, professionalism, grace under pressure, stoicism when it counts. That for me is like the face of this extraordinary performer, the heist film now in this female-centric group, of her almost realizing I need to, push that emotionality down. That's going to undo me. From here on in, I'm in control and I must take action. It's also interesting too that the troupe of women, I was watching this film and a little skeptical about what their actual skills are. Like Elizabeth Debicki, they're recruited. It's like, well, what are they going to do? We don't have, safe crackers and sharpshooters and the muscle as we would classically anymore. But what brings them together for me is a kind of shared burden of care. As a quote unquote female aspect to this, their community bond is looking out for each other, being almost sometimes emotionally supportive of each other.
Sure.
And what's funny is in certain ways that links them more intimately than a lot of the male troops we've seen so many times on screen. But it's a really fascinating film for me.
We get that a great example of that is the fact that Michelle Rodriguez's character is assigned, you need to figure out the plans for this place. And she's like, I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no idea what to do about this. And
but
Elizabeth
they help each other out, don't they?
Yeah. And Elizabeth Debicki is like, hey, I might be able to help you with that. Let me see. And
that's not heist film. Heist characters do not multitask. They do one thing. Often they're identified by like causal continuity.
Yeah.
Motivated characters boil down to just one trait, one thing. Here it's more, roving and fluid and quite emotionally engaging because of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with it. I mean, it's what's unique, I think, in this film is that the collectivity or the group that they form is a vehicle for them to be able to discover the capacities that they didn't think they had. Right. Which I think is it's beautiful. And aside from the fact that it's also quite original to have basically a heist form in order to repay the debt of a failed heist. A failed heist. It wasn't just failed, but it was failed because of the kind of male betrayal, basically, right?
Yeah.
Which to me is it's even more than just putting female characters into a regular kind of heist plot. Just keeping the regular plot and replacing male protagonists with female protagonists. In a way, the film takes seriously the female protagonicity because it modifies the plot. I mean, it sort of takes seriously that female protagonicity in the genre has to come, in some sense, in the wake of the failure of male protagonicity. And it takes that task on to, I think, open a really kind of unique dimension and a new direction, I think, for the genre. And the other thing I would just say is that it's also a great Chicago film. And the kind of what's amazing about the film is the amount of study and attention to the specificity of the place that both Steve McQueen, but also the screenwriter Gillian Flynn sort of demonstrate in this film. And, Tim was saying how the French heist film pay attention to the place, like Paris, for instance, is this kind of iconic setting. But I think the US, the Hollywood heist, it really only starts with the 70s, with films like, Peter Yates's The Friends of Eddie Coyle, which is really where the setting, the kind of Boston and its sort of suburbs become almost as important as the characters themselves. And I think Steve McQueen's film, like The Widows, is in line with that. It's a film that's it's interested in the action of the heist, but it's also interested specifically in how that action reveals, the dynamics of the place in which the heist takes place. And McQueen talks about this in the interview, sort of seeing the Chicago as both a kind of microcosm of its own, but also a kind of global city that reveals large kind of political, socioeconomic questions that plague many contemporary cities, across the world. So to me, that's another sort of really significant part of this particular film, alongside, of course, the attempt to really take seriously the kind of collectivity as something formed by women protagonists rather than male protagonists.
I think that's a really important point you make there, Luke. I really, another of my favorite shots. I talked about the close-up of Viola Davis there, but just the scene where Colin Farrell is making a sort of abortive, half-hearted speech.
The sequence shot,
The sequence shot. You know where I'm going. Watching these heist films, we all have favorite shots. Here's another one, the long take car, the camera's mounted on the car, and as he's, essentially whining, and his female assistant is, you're ridiculous. You're a child of privilege. And the camera is showing us, from crumbling tenements, from wastelands to red bricks and mansions, of just all in one shot. It's like, this is what gentrification looks like. This is the line of power. This is how social mobility works for him, but not other people. And again, of just continuity. Why do heist films so iconic? They're so great about place. I mean, you just described it for us really fluently for us, Luka. But just, I would link this back to as well the end of Rififi. Everyone talks about the wordless jewelry shot. There's another long sequence with no dialogue at the end of the film, as Tony is desperately, he's been shot, of course, and he's driving back into Paris, if you remember that sequence, and he has recovered the child from this bizarre villa that's being built. It's Saint-Veuvray. It's about 20 minutes drive then southwest of Paris. So it's a similar kind of shot of where is the money migrating in Paris to affluent areas south of the city, and just some charts, is he going to be able to get this child back in? And as we're getting all these extraordinary, like a time capsule of urban growth, of Paris's development. Same thing here in Widows with Chicago, with this like backdrop of the film becoming a really poignant time capsule. It has this sort of socio-economic aspect to it as well. But it's just, for me, filmmakers who are really fluent about geography and about how different populations live, and about why money and capitalism is the undergirding principle that makes all of these films really tick.
Well, and this one also really ties in the political nature of all of this, where it's a heist, which, as we learn, in some capacity had been one political party against the other political party, is kind of like what the whole heist was. And at the end, they're going into the mansion that Colin Farrell and his father, Robert Duvall's character, that they live in, and they're taking all of their money. And that's another fascinating element. And I love the moment when we have Viola Davis kind of doing her scout, where she's kind of seeing the house, and she's like, "Oh, I've met you before," from the working with the school board. And so you have this context where they've met that is now, when they re-meet later during the heist, it's totally thrown as he recognizes her, and it's just like, different, a totally different context from what he had ever seen, and the last person he would have ever expected to be somebody who was actually robbing him. And I find that to be such a fascinating element of the way that final moment plays, is like the political bomb that we have with these corrupt officials on both sides stealing from each other, and a person who is theoretically somebody who's just wanting to do good, wanting to work with the schools and make things better for her community, and here she is now part of this robbery against these people.
I'd also say as well, the backdrop of our conversation, heist films, they've always been there in various guises. Perhaps they'll forever be there too. But what changes and what's different, what's interesting with this film, as very close to the end, that last smile, we get female solidarity right at the end of the film. It's interesting for me, this very welcome, very overdue female recalibration of this cycle of films, of the very emphatic way we end with Viola Davis's character Veronica donating money to found a school library in the name of her son who's been murdered by the police.
Yeah.
Of this extraordinary, for me, watching heist films as we all do, it's this really extraordinary moment of a female voice articulating social responsibility and social accountability, and also, dare I say it, I pause before I make a very general statement, a vanishingly rare moment where these kinds of films offer up a sort of legacy of a crime act for the greater good that is profoundly unselfish.
Yeah.
That is a maternal gesture here. It's a kind of retribution for a past wrong. And it's a way in which, for once, the ending of Inside Man, completely abstract about the fate of Christopher Plummer or not, but we're led to believe something permanent something lasting, maybe something. School libraries give us social mobility. They are catalysts for positive change in our world. A heist film and a protagonist and this extraordinary protagonist gives us something lasting, a sort of a nod to something good coming from all of this chaos and despair, basically. So for me, McQueen specializes in these really, I think, deeply ironic moments of small victories from larger scale catastrophes. But this is one of his best plotting moments, I think. It's a really lovely, again, beautifully ironic heist moment. That.
Yeah. Any last thoughts on this one, Luka?
No, I mean, no point, and this was a perfect way to end, I think. Nothing to add.
Yeah. Fantastic. Both of you, wonderful conversation talking about heist films, a wonderful set of films. And I know we could have done it in 10 different films and had as equally engaging a conversation. And there are just so many wonderful examples of this. I appreciate both of you. As I said, you've both provided me with a list of some additional films that I'll put in the show notes so people can jump to those. And I've created some letterbox lists where people can see your other recommendations and check those out as well. Lots of great options on there. Again, both of you, thank you so much. Before we go, anything to plug? Anything or any socials that you want people to check out, or any books you have, or anything? Luka, let's start with you. Do you have any plugs?
I think instead of a plug, I'll just
Oh, it's a mystery.
Oh no.
I was going to say, instead of a plug, I'm simply just going to end by apologizing for my miserable internet connection. And hopefully, Andy, I've given you some material that you could use in the final episode of this podcast. So I'm not going to plug anything. I'm just going to say sorry for my internet.
Okay. Well,
Luka, if heist films teaches anything, it's that you can't handle fate. Your life is not in your own hands.
That's right.
Internet,
all
there's our
probabilistic.
21st century.
Yeah,
that's
So
right.
it's not your
That's
fault.
right.
In fact, this makes you all the more human.
That's right. Yeah.
indeed.
Well, thank you for having us, Andy. I will just filmmattersmagazine.com, if I can put in a pitch for that. I mentioned the great heist essay we have coming out in our upcoming issue. Please go visit that site. I can hold it up to camera here. The best laid plans. I have an essay in here which I look back on quite fondly, and it's got, if nothing else, my article in that book chapter. A really lovely book. I really enjoy it. There's great essays on heist films of all nationalities there. If nothing else, it's got loads more citations of French films. I would love people listening, watching, to go and see some more French stuff. The French are brilliant at commercial films. They are great at heist films. They are just there to be discovered. So I hope that can send people off in some interesting viewing directions.
I will second that.
Yeah.
I use this book when I teach heist films as well. So definitely check it out.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, both of you, again, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here and being part of this fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Andy.